Want to say hello to everyone and welcome you to our public workshop on candidate chemicals in artificial turf. My name is Ashley Blasio, and I'm a public participation specialist with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. And thank you so much for joining us today. This workshop will be focused on discussing candidate chemicals in artificial turf, and it is led by our Safer Consumer Products program. A background document has been prepared, and we are asking for public comment on it and seeking information on specific questions pertaining to candidate chemicals in artificial turf. The 61-day public comment period is currently open, and it runs until Monday, September 30th, 2024 at 11:15 p.m. We will be covering ways in which you can leave and submit a public comment. I'll also be facilitating a live public comment portion towards the conclusion of the meeting, and I encourage you to provide us with feedback. Subtitles are available for the meeting. You'll just want to click on the CC icon on the toolbar below. And this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted to our website. Next slide, please. So I'd like to cover the agenda here. First, we will have opening remarks. Next, we will cover the Safer Consumer Products prioritization process. Next, we will have an overview of candidate chemicals in artificial turf, followed by a Q&A session, which will then be followed by a 10-minute break. Then we'll have external presentations and a Q&A session. We will then take a second 10-minute break. And after that, we'll open it up for public input, and we will conclude with closing remarks. Next slide, please. As a reminder, the written public comment period is open, and we have QR codes and clickable links posted on the screen to both the background document and the CalSafer site, where you can submit comments up until September 30th, 2024, at 11:59 p.m. All right, and that's it for opening announcements. And now I'd like to hand it over to Deputy Director of the Safer Consumer Products Program, Robin Christensen, for opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our virtual public workshop on candidate chemicals in artificial turf. My name is Robin Christensen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Safer Consumer Products Program. You will also hear us refer to ourselves today as SCP or the SCP program. I'm thrilled to see so many webinar participants here today, and I really want to thank you all for joining us in this critical public engagement process. As Ashley mentioned, earlier this month, we shared out our background document on candidate chemicals in artificial turf, and that included our preliminary research findings. But the SCP program first began evaluating chemicals in artificial turf back in 2022. This was motivated by many public comments that we received on our proposed regulations to list carpets and rugs containing PFASs as a priority product. Commenters indicated that, similar to carpets and rugs, many children and athletes of all ages experience close contact with artificial turf, particularly while playing sports. So today, you will hear from several technical experts from DTSC's Safer Consumer Products program, as well as industry and academic experts. We will be starting with an overview of the Safer Consumer Products framework to illustrate how our program works. This will then be followed by a presentation highlighting our preliminary research findings on the candidate chemicals in artificial turf and what we've learned about their potential to cause or to contribute to adverse impacts in humans and the environment. We will also discuss the next steps in our process and how you can get involved as we refine our research to potentially propose one or more of the candidate chemicals in artificial turf as priority products under the SCP regulations. After hearing from SCP staff, we will transition to our external presentations covering a broad range of topics, We truly value our partners' time and involvement in this workshop. And I also want to thank you again, everybody here, for joining us at today's workshop. We look forward to hearing your comments after all of the presentations. And your input and engagement is critical to our process. So we can't do our work without you. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kathy Valentine.
Thank you, Robin, for the introduction. Some of you may already be familiar with our process, but for people who are new to our program, I'm going to provide a quick overview of the Safer Consumer Products Framework. Safer Consumer Products regulates consumer products placed into commerce in California through a 4-phase process. The first phase is our candidate chemicals list. A priority product must contain one or more of the chemicals on this list. It's managed by our program and is a compilation of chemicals that DTSC or other authoritative bodies have identified as a potential concern. When selecting a priority product, chemicals on this list are evaluated within the context of consumer products. In the priority products phase, we research product chemical combinations and prioritize them based on their potential to cause harm to people or the environment. And when we've completed our research, we may propose that a product chemical combination be listed as a priority product through rulemaking. Artificial turf is currently in the preliminary research and public engagement steps of this phase of this process. After we've completed the rulemaking process and listed a priority product, we move to the alternatives analysis phase. Responsible entities must notify DTSC that they sell, manufacture, distribute, transport, or otherwise place a priority product into the stream of commerce in California. They must also either choose to remove or replace the chemical of concern in their product, or they may evaluate safer alternatives through our alternatives analysis process. Finally, following the completion of the alternatives analysis process, we enter the regulatory response phase. We may implement any of 6 regulatory responses based on the extent to which it protects public health and the environment, along with considerations for the economic interests of the responsible entities and the cost to government. In the next few slides, I'll break down the priority product phase and explain how we prioritize product chemical combinations. So the product chemical prioritization process begins with initial screening research and public engagement on a topic. In this phase, we evaluate one or more products or chemicals and then identify product chemical combinations with the potential to cause harm to people or the environment. Some of the product chemical combinations we identify may be prioritized to move to the next step, where we conduct further research and write a product chemical profile. This is a detailed document describing the rationale for proposing a priority product. This is followed by the proposal of a priority product and a public pre-regulatory workshop. The feedback we received during that workshop, along with the comments received during the external scientific peer review, are used to refine the profile. Our research process concludes with the initiation of a rulemaking to list one or more priority products. We consider the prioritization of the product chemical combination at each step in this process and incorporate feedback from interested parties through public engagement. This workshop is part of the preliminary screening research and public engagement phase. We completed our initial evaluation to identify candidate chemicals in artificial turf and their potential to cause harm to people or the environment, and then earlier this month released the background document describing our preliminary results. We're currently holding a comment period seeking input from the public, and following this public comment period, we may prioritize one or many product chemical combinations identified in artificial turf, and then begin summarizing our research into a product chemical profile. The criteria for prioritizing any product chemical combination are described in the Safer Consumer Products regulations. Our process is based on a precautionary principle and doesn't rely on a quantitative risk assessment. We select priority products based on two key prioritization principles. There must be potential exposure to a candidate chemical in the product, and this exposure must have the potential to contribute to or cause significant or widespread adverse impacts. These potential adverse impacts are looked at across the life cycle of the product, including waste and end of life. The information provided by the public during this comment period will help us gather information, identify interested parties' perspectives, fill data gaps, and determine what additional research is needed before we would decide whether to propose one or more priority products. Hopefully this provides you with insight into our process of prioritizing product chemical combinations for proposal as a priority product. More details on how our program operates are available on the Safer Consumer Products website. And with that, I would like to introduce our next two speakers, Armin Etemad and Elena Galkina, who will be presenting an overview of our background document on candidate chemicals in artificial turf.
Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. My name is Armin Etemad, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Elena Galkina. We look forward to sharing some of our preliminary screening findings from our public background document on candidate chemicals in artificial turf that was released at the beginning of this month. So today, Elena and I are going to be covering a wide range of topics for you, starting with a bit of an introduction about the background and the history behind this effort, followed by defining the product and the scope of what is being considered. Then we'll share some market data, potential pathways for exposure, information on the chemical classes used as additives in the product, and the product's end of life. We'll then wrap up with a brief discussion on the preliminary list of potential alternatives that we've identified, as well as opportunities for various interested and affected parties to get involved in our process. Research on artificial turf was first brought to our attention during the rulemaking period for PFASs in carpets and rugs. We received about 20 public comments asking for artificial turf to be included within the scope of that rulemaking. There was also a tremendous amount of new research being done to identify chemical constituents in the product at around the same period of time. Two of these researchers are here today to give a presentation on their work and more recent developments. They are Dr. Grant Beasley and Dr. Kyla Bennett. At the time all of this was coming to fruition, we could not evaluate artificial turf since the product did not fall within any of the categories on our priority product work plan. Thus, we expanded the definition of the category known as building products and materials used in construction and renovation in our 2021-2023 work plan to include products that are used in outdoor settings, such as playgrounds, parks, and stadiums. This was also carried over to our draft 2024-2026 work plan, and it's important to note that our evaluation of this product also aligns with all of our policy priorities that we identified in that document. Currently, there are no statewide regulations on artificial turf in California or the chemicals of concern that they may contain. The closest to such was last year when Assembly Bill 1423 was being considered. This bill would have banned artificial turf containing PFASs in California. However, Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed this bill. In his veto message, he specifically directed DTSC to engage with the author and the legislature to consider alternative approaches to regulating the use of these harmful chemicals, such as PFASs, in consumer products. We have since worked with many interested and affected parties to highlight the benefits of the SCP process that Kathy presented about, and we will adhere to the directive to evaluate PFASs and other chemical classes of concern in artificial turf. Artificial turf is a synthetic surface material engineered to mimic natural grass. This product has become quite an increasingly popular, cost-effective alternative to fields and lawns in California because it does not require fertilizer, pesticides, and mowing. Artificial turf is a very versatile product and can be used for many different applications such as lawns, sports fields, indoor stadiums, landscaping, and playgrounds, just to name a few. Despite higher upfront installation costs compared to natural turf, Artificial turf fields are often deemed cost-effective after just 3 to 4 years, with estimated lifespans ranging anywhere between 5 to 15 years. Artificial turf fields can also provide 2 to 3 times as much playing time as natural grass because natural grass fields often require periods of rest and inactivity to remain healthy. Thus, school districts and other field providers can schedule far more events on the same surface throughout the year due to this increased activity time. However, it's important to note that the use of artificial turf also comes with many concerns due to its potential to expose humans and the environment to hazardous chemical constituents, and these exposures can result in adverse impacts. For the purposes of this research effort, we are focused on just the grass-like blades and the backing that they are attached to, as shown in the figure on the right side of the screen of a common cross-section of the product. The blades and backing are the primary components of artificial turf that are required to cover the surface that it's placed upon. There can sometimes be additional materials or layers added to aid in drainage or support, but we consider these to be outside the scope of our research at this time. Infill is often used as a critical material in sports applications, with crumb rubber being the most commonly used. Alternatives to crumb rubber do exist, such as elastomer, polymer, sand, and organic materials such as fiber, cork, and ground walnut shells. However, these are not widely used. I also really want to emphasize that while infill, particularly crumb rubber, may be of great interest to the interested and affected parties of artificial turf here today, we are by no means ignoring the concerns related to it, just because we consider it to be a standalone product that has different responsible entities. Infill is not required for all applications of artificial turf. That is, you still have artificial turf if you remove the infill, but if you remove the blades and the backing, then you're just left with a pile of infill. I also want to remind and reassure everyone that SCP continues to evaluate exposures to chemicals of concern along the entire life cycle of tires, as it already has with 6-PPD and zinc. The production of artificial turf can be visualized as a sewing process demonstrated by the graphic you see on the screen, most commonly referred to as tufting. In this process, first, resin is combined with additives to form a versatile taffy-like mixture, which is then extruded and stretched into blade-like fibers that can be woven and spooled just like natural fiber. Then these artificial turf blades, most commonly made of polyethylene, are then woven into a backing, which typically consists of a polyester or polypropylene. This backing is sometimes coated with polyurethane to provide strength and produce a mat similar to carpet. Artificial turf's manufacturing process will be additionally covered in much more detail by external presentations, even by some of our panelists who are members of the Synthetic Turf Council. Artificial turf's overall sales have increased by about 15% in North America since 2017, and all other statistical measures also confirm this upward trend in popularity. For example, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry estimates that the number of artificial turf fields has nearly doubled in the United States in the last decade, which, as a whole, it's quite important to note that the United States accounts for an entire 90% of the North American market. At this time, we were unable to identify state-specific data on the total amount of artificial turf used in California. We were, however, able to estimate its use in California based on national statistics. In 2018, there was an estimated 800 to 1,000 artificial turf sports fields in California, approximately 10% of which are from the United States. More recent estimates show that approximately 140 to 150 artificial turf fields were constructed in California in 2021 alone. It's also important to note that sports fields only make up a portion of artificial turf installations. The non-sports field segment of the market accounts for roughly 1/3 of all installed artificial turf projects. Artificial turf users, such as athletes, children, pets, and people who reside near residential turf installations, may be exposed to the candidate chemicals in artificial turf during sport, play, and leisure from several different pathways. Some examples include activities on artificial turf that may cause contaminated dust and turf particles to be inhaled, microplastics to be ingested, or additives to be absorbed through the skin. We also want to acknowledge the great work that one of our other Cal EPA boards, departments, and organizations, which we'll refer to as BDOs, is taking on. The California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, known as OEHA, is currently conducting an assessment of potential health impacts associated with the exposures to chemicals released from both artificial turf and crumb rubber. An additional consideration to note is that children are particularly sensitive to the adverse effects that can result from exposure to candidate chemicals in artificial turf. This is due to age-specific periods of susceptibility known as windows of vulnerability that occur during the active stages of growth and development. Children are much more sensitive to toxic chemical exposure because of their low body weight compared to adults, increased relative breathing rates, and hand-to-object-to-mouth behaviors. Aquatic organisms, wildlife, plants, and soil organisms may also be impacted by candidate chemicals leaching out of artificial turf, some of which have been detected in surface water, groundwater, wastewater, and drinking water, and have been detected in invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. A potential exposure pathway can occur when weathered artificial turf blades or backing are released from the product and carried to the environment and ingested. Additionally, off-gassing of volatile chemicals may be another exposure pathway for species residing near artificial turf fields. At this point in the discussion, I would like to pause and pass it on to my colleague Elena, who will provide more information on the specific chemical classes that we evaluated.
Thank you, Armin, for a great start. And as Armin said, I will continue the discussion and talk about chemical classes of potential concern. The manufacturing of the artificial turf requires the use of chemical additives to ensure the integrity of the product throughout its lifetime. But information on chemicals used in artificial turf is limited and often proprietary, and nevertheless, our team identified several broader functional classes that are commonly used. So, for example, processing aids enhance the process of extruding plastic thread and reduce thread surface defects. And this class of additives is represented by fluoropolymers that belongs to per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, further referred to as PFASs. Another concerning functional class we identified in the literature is plasticizers, such as orthophthalates. Orthophthalates are usually used to soften plastic material. And we will talk more in depth about these two chemical classes in next slides. But additionally, we identified the following functional classes. The colorants. Colorants are added to plastic resins to impart this gorgeous green color. And examples of colorants are copper metallic complexes and organic compounds like azo-dyes. There are also antioxidants that needed to prevent plastic from degradation caused by oxidation. An example of such chemicals are phenols and organic phosphites. And light stabilizers that prevent or slow down degradation caused by light, ultraviolet radiation, and heat. The examples of such chemicals would be hydridamine stabilizers and zinc tinovines. However, we haven't dug deep into last three functional classes due to large universe of compounds within these classes. And we do not possess comprehensive information on specific compounds. And we ask the public to provide us with more information about identities of other additives used in manufacturing of artificial turf blades and backing. Next slide, please. We're especially concerned about presence of PFASs in artificial turf. According to our definition, all chemicals in PFAS class contain at least one carbon that is fully fluorinated. That means fluorine atoms replace all hydrogens bound to carbon atom. On the right, you can see an example of such a molecule. It's a perfluorooctanoic acid, which has 7 fully fluorinated carbons. By some estimates, there are more than thousands of chemicals in this class that satisfy DTSC definition of PFASs. PFASs have been used in a wide range of industries since the 50s to make products waterproof, oil, and stain resistant. And therefore, PFAS are ubiquitous in our everyday environment. The carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest in chemistry. It's very hard to break down under typical environmental conditions, and hence, these chemicals are often called forever chemicals. Next slide, please. And next, we'll discuss 2 subclasses of PFASs that have been identified in artificial turf, fluoropolymers and other non-polymeric PFASs. As previously said, fluoropolymers are used as processing aids in artificial turf and help to reduce product surface defects. And while fluoropolymers are inert, they often bear residual non-polymeric PFASs, which are used in manufacturing of fluoropolymers themselves. Additionally, fluoropolymers may release monomers during product's use and end-of-life stages. Fluoropolymers can also form microplastics that will persist in the environment. People, including sensitive populations such as children and workers, can be exposed to fluoropolymers through inhalation or ingestion of plastic particles. And this can occur when playing on artificial turf, maintaining it, or installing the artificial turf surfaces. Some researchers identified presence of per- and polyfluoroalkyl acids, or PFAAs, and their precursors in artificial turf. However, we do not have information on where these chemicals may come from. And as I said, these non-polymeric substances could be present in artificial turf as residuals from manufacturing processes. And with this, we ask the public to provide us with more information about presence of non-polymeric PFASs in artificial turf. Exposure to PFAS can occur through inhalation, ingestion, and even dermal contact. PFASs are also mobile and can contaminate soil and aquatic environment. And this broad range of exposure pathways increases the risk of human contact with these substances. PFASs and their precursors are particularly concerning because of their long list of hazards, which may include, but are not limited to, carcinogenicity, reproductive and developmental toxicity, and immunotoxicity. These health effects, along with PFAS's persistence, highlight the need for careful consideration of these substances. Next slide, please. Orthophthalates are a subclass of phthalates that are by far the most researched phthalates used by plastic industry. And when used as plasticizers, phthalates are not bound to the polymers and can migrate out of the product at all stages of product's life cycle. And this results in multiple routes of exposure, including dermal, ingestion, and inhalation. In contrast to fluoropolymers, they are not expected to be persistent and only persistent at specific conditions. Studies have shown that phthalates to be endocrine disruptors with the potential for adverse effects on reproduction and development in animals and humans. However, we suspect that orthophthalates detected in blades of artificial turf may be contaminants, and they may originate from infill. Orthophthalates are usually used in polyvinyl chloride products, and yet we found no information that polyvinyl chloride products chemicals would be used in artificial turf. The orthophthalates were detected in artificial turf made of polyethylene and polypropylene copolymers, and these plastics generally do not require any plasticizers. So we again asking the public to help us to fill in this data gap. Next slide, please. Our priority product work plan for 2024-2026 gives special considerations to products that release microplastics into the environment during use and disposal. And we are also in the process of adding microplastics to our candidate chemical list. Plastics are synthetic materials composed of organic polymers and various additives. However, a major concern arises from microplastics. Microplastics are tiny pieces of plastic that are less than 5 millimeters in size, and they come from larger plastic items that break down over time. Artificial turf, commonly used in sport fields and landscaping, contributes to the problem of microplastics. Due to wear and tear, about 0.5% to 0.8% of its fiber mass can break down into microplastics each year. And while this may seem a small number, considering the large area and weight of sport surface, 0.8% of microplastic shedded from an average football artificial turf field may result in over 3,000 pounds of released microplastics. The exposure potential of microplastics is also significant. They are persistent, they do not break down easily, and can remain in the environment for a long time. Additionally, microplastics are mobile. They're spreading through air and water, leading to widespread exposure for both human and non-human organisms. Next slide, please. And as our program is concerned about exposure to candidate chemicals during the entire product's life cycle, we also consider release of chemicals during end-of-life stage. The end-of-life disposal of artificial turf possesses several challenges due to the volume and weight of disposed product. For example, plastic blades and backing of a single average football field would weigh roughly 40,000 pounds or 18 metric tons. The most common method is landfilling, which results in occupation of significant space. And discarded artificial turf has also the potential to leach or off-gas significant quantities of hazardous compounds over time. Incineration is another method which helps reduce volume, but it releases harmful emissions into the atmosphere. For example, upon incineration, fluoropolymers in artificial turf can form toxic combustion products such as halogenated benzene and naphthalene compounds. However, the incineration of waste is minimal in California. Thus, difficulties with disposal often result in illegal dumping of artificial turf, and this leads to escape of chemicals of concern and microplastics to unprotected surrounding environments. While recycling efforts are being developed, only a small percentage of artificial turf is currently recycled. And besides, recycling can also be a source of microplastic pollution if it's not managed properly. Next slide, please. Finally, let's review potential alternatives to 3 identified areas of concern: intentionally added fluoropolymers, orthophthalates, and microplastics. But before that, I want to highlight that we did not evaluate the safety of the alternatives. So for fluoropolymers, literature identified examples of chemicals like boron nitride, thermoplastic urethane elastomers, and polyethylene terephthalate that may be used as processing aids. Additionally, manufacturers can consider some alterations of engineering processes to avoid surface defects and enhance processing speed. If manufacturing of artificial turf indeed use orthophthalates to soften the material, they could resort to techniques that prevent migration of orthophthalates out of the polymer, techniques such as cross-linking and heparin coatings. Or they could substitute the use of orthophthalates with citrate-derived or polymeric plasticizers. And when it comes to release of microplastics, the consumers may opt for organic or conventional natural turf, which differ by the level of used pesticides, but do not contribute to plastic pollution. And with this, I will conclude my portion of the presentation and pass the floor back to Armin, who will conclude our presentation. And take it away, Armin.
Thank you, Elena. I'd like to conclude our presentation by thanking you for your time and attendance today. You may reach out to us directly at the email addresses listed on the slide and our program's inbox, Safe for Consumer Products at dtsc.ca.gov. Additionally, you may subscribe to our electronic mailing list, or e-list, to get the latest SCP news, including our upcoming events and notification about when our slide deck and recording for this webinar is available. The eList subscription link is located on our homepage at dtsc.ca.gov/SCP and also shared in the Zoom chat. Additionally, we invite you to visit CalSafer to provide your written comments and reply to the prompt questions we have prepared on our background document by September 30th, 2024. We look forward to reviewing your comments as we refine our research, and your voice does really matter, as evidenced by the progression of this effort and many others that our program will take on in the future. And now I'd like to pass it back to Ashley for the moderation of today's question and answer session.
Thank you, Armin. Now we'd like to open up for Q&A. So a couple different ways that you can submit your question. You can click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and we'll read it out loud. Or if you would like to ask your question orally, please click the raise hand icon to raise your hand, and we will call on you when it is your turn. And you will have the option at that time to unmute yourself to speak. Please feel free to say your name and affiliation when asking the question. And we ask that you please only ask one question at a time, and we'll go through the raised hands first, and then we'll go to the written question. And just a reminder that we will not be using the chat function for questions, so please do not submit your question or comments there. And a last reminder for phone users is to please press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when it is your turn. All right, and I will go to our raised hands. So we're going to start off today with a question from Anna Grossman. And we will give you permission to speak, and you should have the option to unmute yourself now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. My question is, we're seeing legislation in different states to regulate artificial turf with PFAS. My understanding is all artificial turf has PFAS, and manufacturers are just coming out with slick marketing to deny that. And they're using, a lot of this legislation uses the word intentionally added, which I think is a loophole, and I'm worried about that. Any thoughts?
I can take this question. So thank you, Anna, for the question as well. Our regulations, I can only speak on behalf of ours, will be able to both look at the intentionally added and non-intentionally added uses of chemicals concerned in products. At this point in the stage, I can't comment on what percentage of manufacturers are making such claims. That's something that would be done later in our process with an evaluation of alternatives and that correspondence with manufacturers. However, it's something that we've noted as well, and we'll consider as we move forward with potentially listing one or more of the chemical classes we discussed today as priority products.
Thank you.
Okay. And next we will have Yvonne Watson, and you have the option to unmute to ask your question.
Hi, this is Yvonne Martinez Watson. I'm the chair of the Sierra Club.
Oh, Yvonne, it looks like you might have gone back on mute.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yep.
Sorry. I don't know where I left off. I'm the chair of the Sierra Club California Environmental and Social Justice Committee. And today's presentation is only about artificial turf as you've defined it, because of I'm concerned that this presentation today is not about the types of rubber surfacing used in compliance with the Americans with Disability Act. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Yvonne. Yes, today our presentation is concerned with the blades and backing components of artificial turf. However, I, again, really want to emphasize that we're not ignoring any of the concerns that are related to infill, particularly crumb rubber. Those are being evaluated separately by several other Cal EPA boards, departments, and organizations, and as well within our program under the Safer Consumer Products process as the life cycle of tires, which we've done previously and will continue to do with other chemical classes of concern. So it's considered a separate effort because under our umbrella, crumb rubber and infill is considered a separate product from artificial turf that has separate manufacturing. So that's why we've had to make the distinction between the two.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you for those questions. Looks like, Yvonne, did you have, it looks like your hand went back up?
No.
Okay. All right. We have one more raised hand here with Terry Saucer.
Yes, hi, Terry Saucier. I'm with the SoCal Stop Artificial Turf Task Force and Climate Reality and a number of other organizations. And I'm just curious, I appreciate your presentation so far, but I was curious about the introduction. Some of the statements made about the product itself, I don't believe that they're necessarily accurate, and I didn't know if that would be open to discussion as well. For example, it says here that artificial turf fields may have a higher upfront cost, but after 2 to 3 years, they are cost effective. I would like to say that some research has also shown that artificial turf is 2 to 3 times more expensive than natural grass after a number of other years, like maybe 10 years. So some of these statements I'm not quite sure are accurate. And I'm curious about the life span of the product. It says 5 to 15 years. I know here in California, we're not finding 15-year artificial turf. It's lucky if it lasts 10. So there's some things here I'm just kind of curious if we provide statements or studies, can that be altered? Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. And yes, absolutely. These are, by no means, we don't have all the answers when it comes to some of these data or statistics. This is just the preliminary screening findings from the last few years. But as we do refine our research and develop those more extensive profile documents that were mentioned in the SCP process, we'd be more than happy to follow up and review these studies if you have them available to us, either during our public comment period, or if you want to submit them directly to us at the Safer Consumer Products inbox, we'd be more than happy to review those and incorporate them as needed.
And Armin, I'd like to add a little. Hi, all. I'm Christine Papagni. I lead the product evaluation unit in Safer Consumer Products. And Terry, I also encourage you to submit that as an official comment through CalSafer during our comment period. And we especially encourage you to submit any references you have.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll go on to our next raised hand from Bill Aliot.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Bill Alio, Director of Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. I know some of your staff at the Safer Consumer Products Program. I worked on a bill last year to ban artificial turf with PFAS in it. It was passed by the legislature and vetoed by the governor because it had no enforcement mechanism, and that issue is being worked on by the legislature right now. But my question is, maybe you answered this at the beginning. I missed the beginning of the webinar. I know in your current work priority plan for Safer Consumer Products that PFAS and artificial turf is mentioned in the carpets, I believe, carpets and other rugs thing, because that's a common place where we find PFAS. So is this going to be in addition to that, or is PFAS in artificial turf already the candidate chemical? And how does your work on this interact with that priority product you already identified? I hope that was a clear question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Bill. In our initial rulemaking to capture PFASs in carpets and rugs as a priority product, artificial turf was not included in the definition. This is because at the time, our work plan, which was the 2018 to 2020 work plan, the category of building products and materials used in construction and renovation was only pertinent to ones that are used in indoor settings. So in the next work plan, the 2021 to 2023 work plan, we expanded the definition of this category to include outdoor products that can be used in a wide range of settings, such as parks, playgrounds, and stadiums. And thus, we also indicated in that work plan that our intention was to evaluate artificial turf with this expansion. So this is considered a separate effort from that. That's what we've evaluated now under the umbrella of our new expanded work plan.
Okay, thank you. A slight follow-up. In researching this last year, I saw advertisements for PFAS-free artificial turf. I tried to investigate some of them. I was unable to see any website for a company that actually could prove they had PFAS-free artificial turf. We understand that a silicon-based extrusion process may eliminate PFAS because they say some of it's not intentionally added. It's because it needs to, the plastics needs to slide out at a hot temperature out of these machines to make the turf. That's why there's PFAS in it. But other people said, no, it's part of the actual ingredient because they wanted to shed, body oils and rain and everything else more readily. So that, I think you've covered that both in the question about is it really PFAS free and unintentionally added? But that's a big issue, I think, to look at is who's really out there? Are they really installing it? Because I know your goal is to identify the harmful chemicals, but if someone has already invented one that's PFAS free and it's cost effective and being installed, that's a good thing, but there's all these other chemicals involved as you covered in your excellent webinar. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. And yes, that's something I want to highlight as a great benefit of our program as well is when we do reach the alternatives analysis phase, we do consider a more robust picture in terms of both regrettable substitutions that may be used and other chemical classes that are pertinent as well to evaluate during that phase. And thank you so much once again for your questions, Bill.
Retiring, I won't be here next year. I wanted to add one more thing is the industry claims it saves a lot of water, and this is in their national turf association, whatever their association's called, but their own numbers show it saves about the amount of water used by 30 to 40,000 houses a year nationally, not just in California. So it's a joke in terms of it saving water because you have to water it to keep the heat down. So as far as in California, where we have droughts commonly, they market it that way, like you'll save a lot of water and you won't use pesticides. Well, true about the pesticides, but you will not save much water. A side note, thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And we'll go to our next hand with Andy Schrader. And you should now have the option to unmute yourself, Andy.
Got it. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for your work on this. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the previous caller's work as well on this. I'm Andy Schrader. I'm a soccer dad and very concerned about this issue and particularly the impacts on my child who plays soccer. One of the questions that I have is about there's been a number of studies about the toxic heat caused by artificial turf. And I know that's not a chemical, but is there any state agency that's actually studying the impacts of heat? Because as your report noted today, children are closer to the ground. They're more impacted by the chemicals and the dust, and they're also more impacted by the heat because they're closer to the turf. So I'm wondering if any state agency is studying the heat impacts, and it's particularly important in the areas, the environmental justice areas that have no trees or less shade. Can you speak to that? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, Andy. I'll start with the environmental justice considerations. That's something that's definitely one of our policy priorities in the next 3 years that we can consider. Unfortunately, we only have the authority to look at the chemicals of concern within the product. So heat, while it may be a concern as well for many interested and affected parties here today, is not something that we can use in our evaluation, but we can definitely acknowledge it from the environmental justice perspective. In terms of other state agencies that may be looking at or considering heat in their study, I'd recommend following up with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA. Their report is due out pretty soon as well, but they can provide insight on whether heat exposure and those considerations are being evaluated in their health hazard assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We're going to move on to Vanessa Forsyth.
I had a question also in the Q&A box, but I wanted to ask, can you clarify what the ADA says in terms of, artificial turf? We've been told that it's a requirement, or, that to protect people who are, children particularly who are disabled, that synthetic turf is a better alternative for, playground areas and play surfaces.
I can take this question. Thank you, Vanessa. We currently don't have any information in our preliminary screening analysis about the ADA considerations, but should anyone on the call or anyone looking to make a public comment have these references and sources to share with us, we'd be more than happy to take a look as well.
Yeah, I think it's an argument that's been presented as to why, it should be used. And again, I think there's some conflictual statements being made. So yeah, something else to look into as to what the ADA is actually saying and why. Thank you.
Definitely. We'll note that as well to take a look at from our side as well. And we encourage anyone who has this information to share it with us. Thank you.
All right, and we're going to have David Eisenberg ask your question, please.
Hello, my name is David Eisenberg. I'm chair of the Sierra Club Verdugo Hills Group, and I would like to ask some questions about the comment you made about recycled artificial turf. You said a small percentage of artificial turf is recycled. And as far as I'm aware, there has never been recycled artificial turf anywhere in the world. I know I've looked and other organizations have looked. So when you say a small percentage, a small percentage could be 1,000, 1 out of 1,000 fields they somehow managed to recycle. What I do know that they've done is some companies have taken fields out and cut up some of the unused, the less used portions and sold them for doormats and whatnot. But that's not recycling. That's a one-time reuse. They're still going to end up in the landfill. So I'd like you to clarify where exactly this recycled field is. Just one would be sufficient, and what exactly this small percentage is. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I'll certainly defer to the rest of our artificial turf team to fill in and answer on this one as well. We also will have an external presentation later in the agenda regarding recycling practices given by one of our panelists. So anyone else in the panel able to take this question?
Hi, Armin. Hello, everybody. We do cite 2 companies that purport to recycle artificial turf in our background document on page 10, which one is called Rematch and the other 10 Kate. I don't know that we've done deep research into what they actually do, but they do market that they recycle the blades.
Rematch?
Yeah.
Yes.
If you look on page 10 of the public background document, and then there are references at the end.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go look.
Great, thank you for your question, David. We are going to have Andrea Ventura. You can ask your question.
Hi, my name is Andrea Ventura. I am with Clean Water Action. And first of all, I want to say that if we're recycling a toxic product, that's not a good thing. So I do want to raise that concern. But, you know, obviously this is somewhat of a fraught issue. People are concerned about this product as evidenced by the questions, particularly with their children. And yet, obviously, you're also looking at various really serious problems. I came into this most concerned about PFAS, something I work on, but also the microplastics and the orthophthalates. Given that they have different functions, what is the possibility of DTSC doing a comprehensive analysis of these products and actually regulating at least all 3 of those materials or problems regarding artificial turf? I know they would be separate processes, but is there any way that you could do that? Because resolving one problem doesn't resolve the others, and it would be a very limited regulation. So just wanting to put that question out there.
You want to take
Thank
this
you,
one?
Andrea. Yes. I'll start with thank you for your question. And we definitely consider the entire life cycle of the product within our robust product chemical profiles and our process as well. And I'll also have Andre chime in on this one as well too.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. We need to, for each chemical of concern that we ultimately regulate in a consumer product, and in this case, artificial turf, need to make the finding of potential for exposure, potential for significant or widespread adverse impact. So that's part of what we're hoping to glean from the comments that people submit during this public comment period is sort of information that will help us make the determination that's required for us to regulate a chemical or multiple chemicals potentially in artificial turf. So there's nothing to prevent us from doing that. And we are evaluating all the chemical classes that you've heard about today. So that with the question, is this does this meet our criteria for contributes to or cause significant or widespread adverse impact? We might tackle them individually or in combination. It sort of depends on the timing and what we find and things like that. So generally speaking, when we have information on multiple chemicals, it probably makes sense for us to try to coordinate our regulatory effort.
Thank you, Andre. All right, and Jeff Gearhart, you are up next for your question.
And Ashley, after Jeff asks this question, maybe we should go ahead and answer some of the questions in the chat or the Q&A, because there's quite a few lining up, and I think some of them have already been answered as well. So.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
One of the issues that those of us researching the impacts on plastics similar to artificial turf and human and ecological health, is the particle size dependent toxicity and hazards. And so it's really important as we look at these issues to be specific about what we're referring to. And I would recommend we no longer use microplastics as a category. In these particular types of products, what we're seeing is nanoplastics, which by definition are less than 100 nanometers, as opposed to 100 to 5 millimeters for microplastics. The size-dependent toxicity of these materials is predicted, and I think many people think is going to be really critical to understanding the ecological and human health impacts of these products. And the combination of the particle size and the chemical composition of the particles are really important to at least assess on a hazard basis of how what are we doing when we're creating particles that can cross the blood barrier and get into different parts of both human, but also other parts of the ecosystem. So I wanted to highlight that point as we talk about plastic particles, that we be specific about the size ranges that we're talking about. Thank you.
And at this time, I'd like to remind people right now we're trying to do a Q&A, clarifying Q&A from the presentation that our staff gave, and we'll have time for comments later in the workshop. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and address. Oh, go ahead, Armin. All set. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and address some of the questions that were submitted in the Q&A box. We have a question from Catherine Dodd. Is temperature heat exposure part of the safer consumer products consideration, burns and heat stress for children? I think we did touch on the heat a little bit earlier.
The answer is no. We regulate chemicals. Go ahead, and Christine, sorry.
That's okay. That's what I was going to say, Andre.
Right. Okay, and we have a question here from Suzanne York. What is the status of legislation regulating artificial turf?
I think it was vetoed, right? In California, there's legislation in other states.
Yes, in California, AB 1423 was the only statewide, covering the entire state's legislation related to artificial turf that we're aware of at this time, and that was vetoed last September by Governor Gavin Newsom.
Great, thank you. And I do just want to acknowledge the other heat question that was submitted from David Eisenberg that we did touch on already. We have a question here from Shakura Azimi Galon. Hi, Libby Davis, Science Manager from the Center of Environmental Health. Statistic of 2,000 to 3,000 pounds per year of escaped microplastic. Is that statistic for California, nationally, or worldwide?
I can take this question. Hi, Libby. So we use those numbers, 0.5%, 0.8%. They were taken from report made by Scandinavian countries. So you can imagine that they have different climate, and this number of shedded microplastic would be differently depending on how intensively the field is used, depending on the climate. But those are only numbers that have give a definite understanding of how much biomass it would shed. And there is no any other studies, at least we didn't come across other studies that would specify those numbers that would be done in different countries. Most of those studies done in North European countries.
Thank you, Elena. And we have a question here from an anonymous attendee. Will crumb rubber infill and alternative infills be evaluated at a later time? Is there a plan for infill to be evaluated for the candidate chemical list?
Thank you for the question. We share our active projects on the Safer Consumer Products timeline, which is available at dtsc.ca.gov/SCP. So infill and any other upcoming projects and their respective timelines will be shared on that platform.
Great, thank you, Arlene. We have a question here from Vanessa Forsett. Where is incineration of microplastic when synthetic turf happening? And what is environmental impact to surrounding communities?
I can take this question. Currently, we don't have any information on incineration related to artificial turf in California, since we suspect that it's very minimal. In terms of the environmental impact to surrounding communities, we'd be more than happy to take on any references or sources of information that can be shared for us to support our narrative on incineration that we provided and presented on today.
Great. We have a question here from an anonymous attendee. Given different functions for chemicals of concern, is there any possibility of regulating PFAS or orthopatholates and microplastics, all of which are large problems?
Thank you again for the question. Something that we do consider during this phase where we're gathering research and exploring is the presence of these chemicals of concern in the products. Certainly, if there is that established for multiple chemical classes, that's something that can be explored as well. I encourage you as well to tune into the recording that was from our Green Ribbon Science panel presentation given on this topic earlier this summer, which is on the SCP website as well. But in terms of priority product listings, it'll depend on the results of our comment period and evaluation of the great public comments that we received by September 30th, and shortly after, if there are any that we've identified to prioritize as priority products, those will be provided on the SCP timeline as well.
Our next question is from Ranjit Gill. What is the DTSC SCP proposed regulator and or enforcement concentration for PFAS to be considered intentionally added in turf?
I will take this question. That is premature. We aren't actually announcing a proposed regulation of any of the chemicals we've talked about today at today's workshop. So if and when we get to the point of regulating PFASs in artificial turf, especially if there are instances where it isn't intentionally added and others where it is, then we would, be specifying an alternatives analysis threshold, and that's a threshold below which manufacturers would not be required to go through the alternatives analysis process that Kathy Valentine talked about at the beginning of today's workshop.
Thank you, Andre. Our next question is, does DTSC intend to reach out to Synthetic Turf Council or to U.S. manufacturers to gather direct information on the use of these chemicals in their manufacturing processes?
Engagement with the external parties is part of our process at Safer Consumer Products. And we also encourage you, if you would like to speak with us, you could reach out to us directly, either through the emails that'll be provided at the end of the presentation or at our Safer Consumer Products at dtsc.ca.gov email.
Our next question is from Peter Schultz Allen. Are you working with the State Water Resources Council Board on the impacts of synthetic turf and storm water runoff?
Yes, we do work with our other Cal EPA boards, departments and organizations such as the State Water Resources Control Board on a wide range of our efforts, including this one as well. We'll definitely collaborate and reach out to them for any data that they may have to share with us on artificial turf and the impacts in terms of stormwater runoff.
Can I just interject that we do have a presenter from the Synthetic Turf Council on the agenda today as well. So to the previous question.
Thank you for that. Next question here. There are a lot of stakeholders with both very positive and very negative feelings and opinions on artificial turf. Will DTSC take opinions into consideration in their rulemaking process, or should specific studies or references be provided in order to be considered?
The short answer is yes to both. We encourage you to provide references or specific studies, but even if you just have general comments, we will also consider those, both positive and negative.
Thank you. From anonymous attendee, will you be including pour and plastic padding for children's playgrounds?
So unfortunately, pour and plastic padding is not considered within the scope of this effort, but we certainly welcome any comments or suggestions for other related projects that you may have during our comment periods.
Thank you, Armin. From Jerome Cruz, are there studies that investigate PFAS leaching from artificial turf? Does it leach significantly when exposed to rainwater, for example?
I'll go ahead and take this question. Since we've only done preliminary screening research at this point, we haven't actually looked into the leachate that's coming off of artificial turf. If and when we decide to propose one or more priority products of candidate chemicals and artificial turf, at that point we'll do more in-depth research on whichever chemical in turf we're looking at, especially PFAS or the PFAS class, and we'll evaluate that at that time.
I also want to add on this that at our preliminary screening, we only identified 2 studies that looked into PFAS and leaching, one by Lauria et al. From Sweden. I think it's from 2022. And the other study done by a student from Yale, Zuccaro et al., 2023. They measured fluorotelomers in artificial turf, but not the leaching. They just extracted some low concentrations of fluorotelomers from blades. These are only 2 studies that we know so far, and we really would be grateful if you have extra information on this topic, submit to us via comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Elena. I just want to interject really quick. I want to respectfully ask that people not put comments into the chat. We will not be considering any of the comments in the chat. So we request that you provide any comments later in the workshop during our comment phase, or please put the comments through CalSafer or send them to saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov. But I've noticed there's a lot of messages going on in the chat, and we respectfully ask you to please withhold doing that and simply put questions into the Q&A at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. We have a question here from Peter Schultz-Allen. Do you have any idea on the amount square feet of synthetic turf currently installed in residential yards, like single-family homes versus non-residential properties like parks, stadiums, etc.? I'm wondering if the number of small installations outnumbers the large installations, so it might be a larger amount of square feet installed. And that's pertaining to California, the question.
Thank you, Peter. Unfortunately, the short answer is no. We don't have any statewide metrics on artificial turf installations. We were able to provide some estimations today and in our background document based on national statistics. But we certainly encourage if anyone has any California-specific statistics or market data to please share those with us at this time. during our comment periods.
A question here, again, going back to, we may have touched on with the heat. How does heat on synthetic turf increase the release of chemicals? Is that being studied?
In terms of off-gassing of chemicals, it is something that would be something that we could consider and something that is being researched. So we certainly welcome any studies related to heat resulting in off-gassing of the chemical classes that we discussed today. But the heat itself cannot be the lone consideration in terms of what we can move forward with.
All right, and our next question here from Bob Dupola. Please define the word turf, which is being co-opted by manufacturers and marketers. Plastic grass is artificial, but I question the use of the word turf for scholastic and legislative purposes.
Thank you, Bob. We're certainly aware of a lot of synonyms used to describe this product. And if you have any recommendations in terms of either the product scope or definitions, we highly recommend you to present those to us along with any accompanying recommendations during our comment period.
Thank you, Armin. Anonymous attendee asks, who should we contact specifically at OEHA?
Very good question. I know the primary contact has changed over time. They do have a contact link for this specific effort on their page. I would recommend that, and it's something that we'll provide in the chat as well today. So that would be my recommendation, is to start out there. And also, you may reach out to us as well at our Safer Consumer Products inbox to make that connection as well after the webinar.
Okay, and here's a question from Andy Schrader. Could you please write down the name of the department who might be checking into heat impacts of plastic grass?
Same as the last question, we'll drop the link to OEHA's synthetic turf page as soon as we're able to obtain it.
And we have a question here from Terry Saucier. When evaluating the chemical exposure from artificial turf, is the product being tested in real world circumstances? Example, in California, we have many hot sunny days. The heat would increase outgrassing and the sun would increase wear and tear of the plastic product, thereby increasing the shredding of the grass blades into our environment and waterways, etc.
So in our background document, we acknowledge that some of the studies that we reference are not specific to California, and California's climate is unique in the sense that you have described as well. So during our evaluations in the future for a product chemical profile, as well as the rest of our process, this is something that we'll consider as well as we reference studies and look at test data and other accompanying research.
Thanks so much, Armin. Question here from Peter. Do you evaluate how the various chemicals interact in the installed environment? Example, not just in a laboratory. I think this is also called synergistic effects.
Thank you, Peter. So in our evaluations, we do consider the entire life cycle of the product, from when it's manufactured to when it's used, transported, its end of life, and how it interacts within the environment, within the scope of both human health and environmental concerns. So those profiles are very robust, and we're not quite there yet. And the purpose of these exploratory workshops, such as the one we have today, is to begin these conversations and really help the public help us out in terms of identifying some of these studies. So if there are any artificial turf related studies on how these chemicals interact with the environment, including a lot of the considerations mentioned in previous questions, I once again encourage you to share that information with us. It would be really helpful. And I also want to acknowledge that we do have a very packed agenda today, and there are a handful of open questions we'll get through. Any other ones that we're unable to answer, we'll try to answer during the break in the chat directly. But we will have 2 other sessions with Q&A answers upcoming after ours.
Great, thank you, Armin. And we'll have these last few questions. Carrie Levine, please clarify how the regulatory efforts translate to enforcement with regards to chemicals of concern, such as PFAS.
At this time, we're still doing preliminary research, and any kind of enforcement efforts would not occur at this time. That would only occur if we list a priority product through rulemaking. So a little bit early to provide any answers to that question.
Right, and one more here. Is the reason there is no mention of 6 PPD because there is already an active undertaking by DTSC?
I think I'll jump in for that one. It's I think primarily used in the tires that make the crumb rubber infill, which is out of scope for what we're talking about today. So that's why we didn't specifically mention 6 PPD, that we didn't have information that it was present in the blades and backing.
Right, and we have our last question here, and then we will address the additional questions. And a reminder that if it is a comment, please wait for the public comment portion of the meeting, and we will make comments at that time. But our last question from Catherine Dodd: how will you determine the possible health effects that are observed latently, childhood disease, example, cancer?
If we regulate a chemical in artificial turf, we primarily will rely on scientific literature and published studies, and our scientific basis is then submitted for external scientific peer review. So we will account for those types of latent health effects to the extent that they are in the literature that we are aware of and that we review as part of our pre-regulatory work.
Great, thank you, Andre. And we are going to go ahead and we are going to move into, and great questions from everyone. We want to take a quick 10-minute break before we continue with presentations. But any questions that are left in the Q&A, you can continue to submit those as we continue on with questions, and then we will have another Q&A session after those conclude. We're looking at 10:26 right now, so let's take a 10-minute break and plan to meet back at 10:36, and we will continue on with our presentations at that time. All right, we are at 10:36. Want to just welcome everyone back from the break. We're going to go ahead and continue here with our presentations. We have some external presentations to start, and I'll ask that we go to, great, thank you so much. First, we will hear from Dr. Kyla Bennett, Director of Science Policy for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Graham Peasley, Professor Emeritus from the University of Notre Dame. And I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Bennett.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. I'm going to be talking to you today for a few minutes about PFAS and artificial turf and why it matters. And just so you know, I was one of the 2 scientists that discovered PFAS and artificial turf in 2019. I worked with Jeff Gearhart, who appears to be here today, from the Ecology Center, and he and I were the ones who made this discovery. So industry did not let us know that there was PFAS and artificial turf. And so this is relatively new. It's only been 5 years. So that's why there aren't a lot of studies, but they are being done now. Next slide, please. So we've already gone through what artificial turf is, but the reason I wanted to add this slide is because there have been some statements made by the Synthetic Turf Council and others regarding the safety of artificial turf based on studies done on infill. That infill, in this picture, it looks like it's something like cork, perhaps, but that infill is often, as some of you have noted, crumb rubber. Next slide, please. And we are only talking about the artificial turf here, the plastic blades and the backing, not the infill. And so EPA's recent report, their FRAP, only studied the crumb rubber infill. And the reason that I want to stress this point is that the report itself said that it is not sufficient to, quote, directly answer questions about potential health risks. That's even on the crumb rubber itself. And moreover, they made it abundantly clear that their two studies, one done in 2019 and one just released this year, do not include any information about the plastic grass blades or the backing. Despite this, the Synthetic Turf Council came out with a statement after EPA's latest report that said synthetic turf and its system components are safe, and they cited EPA's report. So I just wanted to head that off at the pass and let you all know that EPA's report said nothing of the sort. They did not investigate anything having to do with the plastic blades or the backing. Next slide, please. So why is PFAS an artificial turf? As others have mentioned, it does act as an extrusion aid so that the molten plastic doesn't clog the machinery, but we have also been told that it's used as a slip agent added to those molten hydrocarbons to make sure that those plastic blades are free of defects. Next slide, please. So which PFAS are used in artificial turf? Both the STC and industry claim that they use fluoropolymers such as PVDF or PVDF-HFP, and they claim that these are not bioavailable, that they are not, they're not harmful, they're very stable. But when we look at which PFAS we're finding in artificial turf, we've found at least 15 targeted PFAS, and there are many others that we can't test for because, as you probably are aware, commercial laboratories can only test for about 70 PFAS, and there are probably more than 10,000 of them. So there are some unknown PFAS in this artificial turf, but there are also 15 targeted ones that we have found. And those are, if you go to the next slide, I have a list of those. This list right here. The three highlighted ones, I highlighted those because they're probably PFAS that everybody in the audience have heard about: PFOA, PFOS, and Gen X. Those are also three of the most well-studied, well-known, and harmful PFAS. And indeed, these three are all now regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in drinking water. Next slide, please. So how is this possible? If we take the Synthetic Turf Council and the industry at their word and they say, no, we only use fluoropolymers, why are we seeing all these PFAS in there? There are a couple of explanations. First of all, these fluoropolymers can degrade under UV light and transform into other PFAS. Next slide. And also, I think it was Armin who mentioned that some of these more legacy PFAS are hitchhikers, if you will, when fluoropolymers are made. And indeed, there are studies that show that the production of fluoropolymers can be intimately linked, and that's a quote, to legacy and novel PFAS as polymer processing aids. So we're not entirely sure where these PFAS are coming from, but we do know that some of them are probably hitchhikers, others are probably degradation products, and we have no idea what the industry is putting in because they don't have to tell us. Next slide, please. So why does it matter? As others have mentioned, there are three routes of PFAS exposure: ingestion, inhalation, and dermal absorption. And athletes playing on artificial turf are exposed through all three of these pathways. And this is a picture of somebody who has what they call turf burn, because this happens regularly to athletes who are sliding on this very hot plastic. And one thing I did want to point out is that Pure did a very preliminary study showing that children in California, in San Diego, and their coach who played on artificial turf fields picked up more PFAS on their skin than they did when they were playing on grass. So are they absorbing it? Perhaps. Next slide. A recent article that came out in June of 2024 says that yes, PFAS can be dermally absorbed, and it's probably a much bigger exposure route than we have previously been aware of. And indeed, they said that even PFAS such as PFOA can be absorbed through the skin. So this is definitely an exposure route and one that we should be concerned about. Next slide, please. This is just a slide about the health issues, and I'm not going to go through it all, but it is worth noting that PFAS can impact virtually every system in our body. And some of them are known or likely carcinogens like PFOA and PFOS, both of which we have found consistently in artificial turf. Next slide, please. So how toxic are PFAS? In April of this year, EPA issued their final regulations, their maximum contaminant levels, stating that there is no safe level of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water, so ingestion. They gave an MCL a limit of 4 parts per trillion, and their MCLG, which is their maximum contaminant level goal, is 0, meaning there is no safe level of this. So if there's no safe level of it, you should not be ingesting it, you should not be dermally absorbing it, and you should not be inhaling it. Next slide, please. So what does all of this have to do with drinking water? This is a picture, if you can see it, of a flooded artificial turf field, which is indeed happening. In fact, EPA says that artificial turf must be considered in stormwater calculations as an impervious surface. So it's as impervious as asphalt. So when we get these new rain bombs that we're getting, these really intense storms, a lot of this water will collect on the top and it will not percolate through this artificial turf. Moreover, in Martha's Vineyard, a study done by a consulting firm showed that 12 parts per trillion of just 6 PFAS, and remember, we're talking about possibly dozens or more that are in this artificial turf, 12 parts per trillion of the 6 PFAS regulated by the state of Massachusetts will leach off a brand new field. And this will probably increase as a field ages, as in it breaks down from UV light, acid rain, and abrasion. So where do you think this PFAS is going? Next slide, please. It is going into our soil, into our groundwater, and eventually into our drinking water. This article just came out last week from Rhode Island. The state officials warned that they took tested the water, the well water, before they put in an artificial turf field, and then immediately afterwards, and the amount of PFAS doubled. This is happening. PFAS is coming off these fields. It is contaminating wells. It is contaminating groundwater. It is getting into the soil. It's getting into the vegetation. It's adversely impacting wildlife. Next slide, please. One of the things that the manufacturers of artificial turf like to say is, this is safe. It's not getting into our water. One of the things that I say in response is the absence of evidence is not the same thing as the evidence of absence. Just because we don't have the studies done yet doesn't mean it's safe. So when they say this is safe, it's not getting into your water, say prove it, because we can prove that indeed it is getting into our water. Next slide, please. The industry is often also claiming that artificial turf is PFAS-free. I'm seeing this all the time now. But every sample that scientists have tested around the country have had PFAS. And the reason they're able to say that it's PFAS-free is that industry and consultants will often use tests designed not to find PFAS. They either have very high detection limits, and I'm going to give you an example of that in a second, or they don't do things like the SPLP, the synthetic precipitation leaching procedure, which will show you what actually comes off when an artificial turf field is exposed to the elements. They also say there's no intentionally added PFAS, and I know this was raised several times. The reason that this is important language. And the reason that we have been urging states when they're doing legislation around artificial turf is to not say intentionally added at all, or to define intentionally added as it's there, because this is a loophole for industry to say, well, we didn't add it. For example, if it's in the machinery that they're extruding this molten plastic through, it's not intentionally added. So in this case, I think it's very important not to use the words intentionally added. Next slide, please. So is there a PFAS-free artificial turf? We have yet to find it. This is a lab report, and oftentimes you'll notice when you find these ads saying, oh yes, our artificial turf is PFAS-free, you have to call the company and ask for their lab reports, which some of them will send you and some won't. This one is from, I think, Water Saver Turf out in California. And if you look at their lab test, you can see that their units that they're testing in are milligrams per kilogram, which are parts per million. And their detection limits are 0.01, between 0.01 and 0.1. Next slide, please. So why is this important? Because their detection limits range from 0.01 to 0.1 milligrams per kilogram, and that's parts per million, their detection limits are between 10,000 to 100,000 parts per trillion. Now think back to a slide I just had a few slides ago, which said EPA said there is no safe level of some of these PFAS. We're measuring them and regulating them in single digits parts per trillion. So they are designing these tests to not find PFAS. So this is something that everybody needs to be aware of. And actually, governmental agencies like DTSC and other states should be mandating what the detection limits are in order for these industries to say, yes, this is PFAS free, or no, it's not. The reason I have a Coke up here is this is just a simple analogy. If you have a Coca-Cola and somebody puts an ad up saying our Coke doesn't have any sugar, and you can see here it's got 39 grams of sugar per can. Well, if you set that detection limit at 100 grams of sugar or 1,000 grams of sugar, yes, that Coca-Cola is going to come back as sugar-free, even though it has 39 grams of sugar. That's exactly what the industry is doing here. Next slide, please. This has also been talked about. Artificial turf sheds microplastics and nanoplastics, hundreds of pounds a year. And this is important for PFAS because, next slide, please, there's recent information that's saying PFAS on microplastics can cause a synergistic effect, if you will. And this article from 2021 said, given the prevalence of PFAS and microplastics in natural waters, coupled with the extremely long persistence time of both classes of pollutants, these two groups of emerging contaminants may act synergistically in food webs to cause adverse effects in fish and wildlife, as well as humans. So we do need to pay attention to the relationship between these microplastics and nanoplastics and the chemicals. Next slide, please. These are just a couple of things that I wanted to mention that were in your background report, that were in DTSC's background report. Artificial turf does need watering. California has similar weather to parts of New Mexico, for example, and a 2017 study in New Mexico concluded that in order to provide a cool, playable surface, irrigation amounts for artificial turf are greater than for natural warm season turf, for regular grass. A 2020 study found that the amount of water required to maintain artificial turf temperatures at levels comparable to natural turf exceeded the amount of water that you'd need for natural grass. So it is not true that artificial turf doesn't need watering. Next slide, please. And as far as recycling, we don't think that there is actually an artificial turf recycling plant in the US yet. There is supposed to be one in Pennsylvania. There was a recent article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about how these turf fields are being found in farmer fields. They're dumped in wetlands. They're in alleys. There was also a Boston Globe article done just 2 weeks ago that showed that turf from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which they paid for recycling. And this was tracked using the bill of lading down to a warehouse in New Jersey, an abandoned warehouse in New Jersey. So the things to look at are, you will be told, and you might be told later today, that turf is recyclable. Having something that's recyclable is not the same thing as it will be recycled. But in addition, even if you are told is going to be recycled, then ask questions about where it's being recycled, what it's being recycled into. Because do we want this PFAS-laden turf to be turned into something that's going to be used as, I don't know, somebody eating off of a picnic table, for example? But this really needs to be questioned because a lot of the recycling is pyrolysis in Baytown, Texas, or it's ending up in farmer fields in Pennsylvania or warehouses in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we have yet to find a brand of artificial turf that is PFAS-free despite industry claims because of how they set their detection limits or how they do the tests. These PFAS will leach off the artificial turf fields and contaminate soil, groundwater, surface water, and drinking water. And even if the industry is able to get PFAS out of artificial turf, it does not solve the problem of the microplastics, the end-of-life recycling, the heat islands, or the fact that this is a plastic fossil fuel product. The year is 2024, and a well-designed, well-maintained grass field can give you everything that artificial turf can, and then some. And it is not poisonous. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. And we'll hand it over to Dr. Graham Peasley.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everybody for coming to listen. This is a story that I'm going to tell, but it was actually pioneered by my student, Heather Whitehead. And you can already see from the figure here where we're designing a publication that isn't published yet, but I can show you some of the figures from it. And like many of other publications, we're worried about PFAS exposure from all sorts of reasons. And Kyla just gave us a great introduction as to why this particular form of PFAS in this particular media is of concern. You have a direct path, you have players and anybody who's on the grass using it that has a potential inhalation, absorption, or ingestion exposure. Not that they eat much turf grass, but the other path that I think is much more concerning to me is, since I don't spend a lot of time on turf grass myself, is the indirect path. And this is these are forever chemicals, and that's why PFAS are rising to the top of all the list of chemicals that DTSC is studying. This is one that is a very concerning chemical. It lasts for hundreds of thousands of years 200,000 of years in the environment, and it can be recycled back into leachate, back into drinking water, back into irrigation water. And so we all end up eating the PFAS at the end. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight the contributions of Heather Whitehead. She received a PhD last year. She's now working for EPA in Region 3. And her chapter 4 in her thesis is about the implementing analytical workflows, a new way to measure how the fluorinated polymer processing aids are added to consumer products. And I'll go on to the next slide, which shows how we measure fluorine is different than everybody else. And that's why we got into this early and often. We look at total fluorine. We measure the fluorine, not the PFAS. And luckily, almost all fluorine out there is either fluoride that's natural or organofluorine, which is put into products intentionally. And we use this wonderful technique as a particle accelerator on the left, and we get a very clear signature of any surface that we look at with respect to fluorine. And that allows us to look not at the really high sensitivity you need for water until we do something separately. We are, in fact, the reason I retired this year is that I'm going emeritus to start up a company to actually do it in water. We found a way to do it in water now. But we started with just looking at plastics, which is the first thing. Next slide. And I'll go through a couple of the papers you may have seen. Many people on this call have actually been part of this paper. Those are the fluorinated compounds in fast food packaging, where we were able to screen, because it's a fast technique, takes 3 minutes to sample. We were able to do hundreds of papers and look at them. And the next slide will show a few more slides of these things. We've done firefighter textiles. That's a textile that is made with a fluoropolymer. So about 30 to 50% of it is pure fluorine. And we found out that that's a source of contamination to both the environment and the firefighters in this case. Next slide. And we'll go through 3 or 4 more slides here just quickly. Cosmetics, almost everybody read this paper. Unbelievable how many people worry about this. But again, the direct path is one way it gets into you. The real concern for me is the millions of pounds of these products, personal care products, that we're putting into the landfill every year that we end up eating. Next slide, please. We've done school uniforms. Industry has been very energetic in trying to find new areas in which to do these things. The next slide. We've discovered that we've looked with the biologists to see where it goes. You can see maternal offloading in eggs. We published the first report of that in fish. Next slide, please. Last year we did this one on directly fluorinated containers, which is a different type of a long-term container. And those can also leach into whatever's inside them. If you put food in them, you can get PFAS out, as we showed. This was also Heather's study as part of her thesis. And she found very high concentrations of it, actually part per billions that could leach out, which is, again, 1,000 times higher than the drinking water limits. Next slide. So this led to our discovery, quote unquote. It's actually unlike the scientific discovery that the students go in the lab and actually discover something new. Heather spent, before, like all good students, she did a lot of research. And we wondered where we'd worked with people sending us turf grass samples for years trying to find PFAS, and we see fluorine in them. We see part per million levels of fluorine, which is a lot of fluorine to be well above our background, of 10 times higher than background. We see these levels of 70 part per million fluorine using this wonderful technique where we just scan the surface. So we had students literally chopping off turf grass flowers and measuring the fluorine. And if you look at any other material, you don't see fluorine. You look at turf grass, you see about 70 parts per million. That's not a lot of fluorine. It's not percent, and so it may not, it might not be potentially added. But then we discovered on no other than the 3M website the discovery of fluorinated polymer processing aids. This is Dynmar PPA. It's number 9613 if you're looking. And this is what's used to make any polyethylene, low-density polyethylene, a little bit less wrinkled when it comes out those extruders. Especially if they go to a heavier mix of polypropylene or polyhexylene, you'll get harder time extruding it. So they put this in to make it smooth, flow smoothly through the instrument. And this was new to us. We had the turf grass industry told us they don't use it, but we found a website that advertised that this was used in turf grass. And sure enough, 3M confirmed that they do sell this. We bought some and we tested it, which was our contribution to this. And the industry now admits that, oh yes, they do use this, but it's not very much and it doesn't come off. Well, neither of those are exactly true either. We'll go to the next statement, please. Next slide. We measured, for Heather's thesis, we measured 27 turf grass samples and 11 packaging samples. These are packages made with the same sort of low-density polyethylene you'd expect on a blade. And the package product packaging was actually higher, but the measured concentration there is all very consistent and all pretty low, about 70 part per million, which is low in one respect, but you worry about what is that in terms of PFAS and where does it end up? And so the paper that was published in, I'll talk to it later, from Sweden, actually didn't do the type of extraction that we did. They did a very gentle extraction of the acetonitrile, and they measured with traditional standard LC mass spec, and they didn't see a lot of PFAS. And in fact, when you see these micrograms per centimeter squared, which is an areal density, it's of the order of 70 part per million in the blade. Those sort of numbers are probably some leftover fluoropolymer that was used in this polymer processing aid. And the fluoropolymers themselves are probably not as hazardous as the PFAS that they're associated with or that they're made from. But whenever you use an industrial supply of fluoropolymer, you always get other bits added for free. Not necessarily intentional, but they're there. And in this case, there are some polymers that use intentional types of carboxylic acids, but more likely they use something called fluorotelmer alcohols. And polyvinylidene fluoride, which is the known ingredient in Dynamar FX9613, they list that as polyvinylidene fluoride, has the paper that was referenced by the DTSC, one of the two, the references they made. One was the Swedish study, the other one is this one out of recently that studied how you measure these things. They didn't measure them with LC mass spec, they measured them with GC mass spec. And they found 300 parts per billion, much, much higher range of this thing. They found actually 1,000 part per billion, 1 part per million of FTOH. 8,2 FTOH. And the interesting part of 8,2 FTOH is that it degrades in sunlight and oxygen into your favorite PFOA. Now, it won't happen rapidly. It'll happen over months, but it will happen. And the amount that you get is, parts per trillion level. Well, we just discovered that parts per trillion, thanks to Kyla's talk, is where the groundwater and the surface water begins to get contaminated. We'll come back to that. Next slide, please. We are getting individual PFAS at part per billion levels. Okay, we see things when we do extractions from these things. We do an extraction a little bit more aggressive than the ones that the Swedish use. We use catchers, quick, efficient, rapid extraction. It's an ionic salt that brings it out. We get things in part per million that comes out, not part per trillion. This wouldn't be applied to a field in the sunlight, but it might be thought of as you did a 10-year aware study all in about 3 hours in the lab. You encouraged whatever was there to come out, but you encourage it to come out now rather than waiting for 10 years. And what we observe is that we get part per billion levels in artificial turf. Low part per billion, you only get extract. And remember, we saw part per million levels. This is 1,000 times less. We see less than 50 part per billion coming out of all the artificial turf samples we looked at. And in there, they're mainly light chains. The C4s are on the left in part B. But there is a nice little spike there at P4, which comes out at, about 20 parts per billion as a max. Average is a little bit lower than that. But several parts per billion of P4 seems to come out of these things. And that's concerning because part per billion is still 1,000 times higher than parts per trillion in our drinking water. So where will this go? Next slide, please. We looked at of all 27 turf grass samples, the highest, the one that was in more samples than anything else was P4. 76% of them had it. Some were below detection limits. I would guess that some of our turf grass came in from well-used, well-watered fields that had probably lost some. We took both new turf grass and old turf grass from sample volunteers around the country, and some of them were 10-year-old turf grass. Perhaps those ones are lower. If we go further, and bear in mind, our detection limit isn't that low on this either. We're going still pretty high. Next slide, please. We tried a different technique just to prove it was there, and we were helped by the fact that 3M sold us a bottle of this product, and we could take a look at. Actually, we took 2 different types of products that were fluorinated polymer processing aids, and you can see clear signatures of in something as easy as Fourier transform infrared spectrometry. You can see that there is a peak or 2 that is a very signature of a carbon fluorine stretch, and that these things are indeed fluoropolymers, which are indeed PFAS. Next slide, please. So we tried another trick, which the Berkeley Origin was a top assay. We didn't get a lot more. One sample gave us 5 times as much, but the other samples didn't give us anything at all. There was a little bit to begin in there. And this is consistent with most of the fluorine that we see. The part per million level that we see is probably polymeric still. And even if you do top assay on it, you don't get a lot more. In one case, there's a mixture of things, and we got a lot more. But again, we're getting nanograms per milliliter. That's parts per billion. We don't see the part per million that we started with, so we're thinking it's fluorinated polymers that don't come off, and that's what we think most of this is. But of course, when you start looking at zero limits, you're going to exceed that very quickly in the individual analytes that are measured traditionally, which is PFOA, PFOS, PFHXA, all those sorts of things come off. And we do see them at part per trillion extraction limits on all of these things. Next slide. So our conclusions, I'm sorry for the words up here, I'm being lazy instead of doing pictures. We see that we're only measuring with the typical commercial LC-mass spec, which everybody sends results out to try and measure. We'll only see about less than 1%, way less than 1% of the PFAS content is actually being measured through this technique. Several other people have discovered this. The Swedish study is one of these things. It says they didn't measure much. There's a bit there, but not much. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that. This is the Loria one. It's a very good study out of Sweden. And they've looked at the turf backing and the turf blades, and they see some PFAS, but not every one of them was above detection limits. And the detection limits there are in low part per billion. You'll see that the sum of the PFAS up top gets to be about half of part per billion at best. So that's 500 part per trillion, and some of them are down to 100 part per trillion, which is getting pretty low. But they used a very gentle extraction technique, acetonitrile. They didn't try UV light. They didn't try oxidizing it a little bit more hard, and we got twice as much or 5 times as much out, but we did a more harsh extraction technique, which I'll talk about at the end a little bit more. Next slide. There are papers coming out describing the toxicity of these things, knowing that PFAS is one of the emerging contaminants that's, now that we know it's there and that it does come off, but it comes off in small values. How worried should we be? So that's a toxicology question. What sort of levels are you sensitive to? And should you be playing on it? Should you be drinking water that runs off from it? Or should you be irrigating your crops with the water that runs off from it? So we'll go to the next slide. And this is where we get back to, do we have enough to worry about dermal absorption on the players? Absolutely. There's a lot there at part per million levels, but hopefully it's fluoropolymeric, which won't go through the skin as easily. But we don't know that. It needs to be studied. We know that there are part per billion levels that we can extract, and with sunlight and water, and you've all seen these fields covered with water, that you will get some off. And I'll mention right now that I've worked now with 4 different studies of areas. The Martha's Vineyard study came out with 12 parts per trillion in their water. The Rhode Island study that was also mentioned by Kylo has found double the amount that was there originally. If you look at any East Coast water supply or wastewater, you'll find a few part per trillion of this washing down the stream, and that's what they in fact had. They doubled it, and when they put a turf grass field in, so it's no longer a few part per trillion, but twice that. Is that concerning? Well, it shows that not once, but 4 different times now, we've seen it where turf grass, if you measure upstream and downstream of a turf grass field, you see that small but measurable increase. Portsmouth was done by a colleague of mine that has worked there and has found, again, a half dozen of these commonly found with analyzed with the LC mass spec. We'll see dozens of different types of PFAS there, and they add up to a few parts per trillion above background, or maybe 10 parts per trillion or 20 parts per trillion in some cases, but not a huge amount like we see in the raw material with part per million levels. And I have also an example from New Haven, Connecticut. Homeowners Association protested to have artificial turf fields not used, and in fact, they went ahead and put it in anyway. So interested homeowners went upstream and downstream of the outfall of this, and they measured 2 things. They measured selenium, which came from the crumb rubber infill, and it wasn't there before, it was now. And beforehand, upstream, there was some PFAS, and it's still there, but downstream, they again see about double. They saw about 8 to 10 parts per trillion of the labeled PFAS of that, and that was 3 or 4 PFAS added together. So I'd say that there is a beginning to be a range of evidence. In a few years, we'll have enough evidence to actually put a whole bunch of things together, showing there is a small but measurable increase in the traditionally measured PFAS. But because I come from a total fluorine background, I wonder what the rest of this stuff is. And I think some of it came out in that Zuccaro paper just recently. Go to the next slide. And there's a reason I want to do this. I think a lot of this is FTOH, which is nobody can look for except a gas chromatogram, and not many labs do that. But I think now that we know that, people will start looking. I'd like to end with sort of a back of the envelope calculation that academics can do. If we say there's about 5 part per billion extracted, I'm going to take a conservative estimate, 5 part per billion of extracted PFAS that are measurable by LC mass spec, without even considering the other ones that we don't measure. I look up how many ounces per square yard there is in that, why there's how many turf graphs, how many meters squared in a standard soccer field, and then some unit conversions. You find a typical mass of blades to be about 24,000 pounds, which somebody said was how you recycle these things. This means a similar extraction to what we did. If we'd put that all through my lab, we'd get about 60 milligrams of PFAS from an entire soccer field. We're going to assume that my technique is a little harsh, and it would take maybe 5 years of environmental exposure to get that much. That's only 12 milligrams released per year, which is a very small amount. You'd have a hard time seeing that with an eye. But if you then asked about if you had 12 milligrams per field in running water coming off of runoff water coming off a field, what is the 4 nanograms per kilogram, 4 part per trillion that PFOA and PFOS uses as the EPA limit? You'd need about 800,000 gallons of water to get it below 4 part per trillion. So that means that that amount would contaminate to the drinking water limits described by the EPA by 800,000 gallons of water annually. And then if you multiply by the number of 12,000 turf grass fields in the US and installing this much, that adds up to a lot of contaminated water. And it's not a massive contamination like you're sitting right next to an airport where they've used AFFF and it's pouring in at such alarming levels everybody switches to bottled water. It's just bumping the background up by a factor of 2. Okay. And this is only a rough approximation, but it is conservative. I think it could be worse than this. And I'll lead, the biggest concern I have is that the PFOA that we observe, and we do see a little spike of PFOA, wondering why we didn't see the ones in between C4 and C8. We see mainly the C8. And the reason is that the polyvinylidene fluoride, which is an integral part of this polymer processing aid, actually comes from a manufacturing process that makes 8,2-FTOH into the fluoropolymer. And therefore, any leftover of that ingredient when they made it will have this fluoropolymer alcohol. Nobody seems to know that yet. And so we're trying to figure out how to prove that. But what we're observing in the Zucchero thing is that there's FTOH on the blade. And that is well known from the 2006 study by a Canadian group that converts into aldehyde and into the acid form eventually in your blood if you digest it in the liver, or if you just leave it out in the atmosphere and add water and air to it, it will convert into PFOA, which is, I think, why some of this is showing up. There's only a small fraction of what the total amount is there, but that's what you'd expect. A small fraction oxidizes each year. So I'll leave it at that. I've left my email address there if people have questions specifically for me, but I will be happy to answer questions at the end with everybody else. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Peasley and Dr. Bennett for both of those presentations. Now, I believe we're going to go back, open it back up for Q&A. A couple of different ways, just reminders to submit your question. You can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type it in. Or if you would like to ask it orally, ask your question out loud, please raise your hand and we will give you the option to unmute when it's your turn to speak. Please feel free to say your name and affiliation when asking the question. And we ask that you please only ask one question at a time. And phone users can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when it is your turn to speak. So it looks like we have a couple questions that were submitted in the Q&A box. And I have one here for Sakura Azimi Galen. It says Libby Davis from the Center of Environmental Health. A question for Dr. Bennett during the next Q&A. Dr. Bennett, thanks for your presentation. When you conducted target analysis for the 15 PFAS, did you also conduct non-targeted analysis, such as total organic fluorine? I'm curious what kind of mass balance you see for those 15 species versus all PFAS that can be detected in a non-targeted method.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Just to clarify, those 15 PFAS were not all found in all samples that were tested. And these were also not all my tests. Some of them were other citizen activists that we helped get tests or other municipalities that tested. So some of the tests, a few of them did a total organic fluorine or an AOF. I don't recall what that was off the top of my head, but not all of them did those tests. Most of the tests were just done for targeted, but I can get back to you on that.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. And we have a question here from Leanne McAlufi, and I apologize if I did not pronounce that correctly. We are now hearing from some California state officials mentioning green chemistry, and that could make artificial turf safe and viable. Thoughts on that?
Who is that question for, about Ashley? Just whoever?
I believe so, or for our presenters. But it looks like more of maybe a open-ended question, if anyone wants to jump in and.
I mean, I would just say that, again, even if the industry is able to get PFAS out of artificial turf, there are other chemicals of concern. And again, it is a fossil fuel product that emits both microplastics and nanoplastics into the environment as well. So to me, the green alternative for artificial turf is natural grass.
Great, thank you so much. We have an anonymous attendee with a question here. Is the 12 milligrams of PFAS calculated for turf fields all PFOA in your final slide to get to 800K gallons?
No, that was actually a 12 that I borrowed where half of it was PFOA and half wasn't. It's just a relative number. And you're right, it would be half that amount if I used PFOA specifically. But I think there are turf grass where we've seen it as high as that. So it could be that turf grass, but that was an average from another field. You're right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peasley. And we have a question here for Dr. Bennett. How many turf samples tested were taken from the environment versus taken from manufacturing locations? How is background PFAS contamination taken into consideration? Also, lab methods set detection limits, not manufacturers or regulatory agencies. Detection limit is dependent on matrix. Water can achieve PPT, solid objects can only achieve PPB.
So all of the samples that I have been involved in, and most of the people I know have used brand new samples direct from the manufacturer. So in other words, we will call a manufacturer, or sometimes we will go there and they will give us a sample that's in a box wrapped up, brand new, has not been on a field. So there's no exposure from the elements. And I know that is something I hear all the time from industry as well. If you test something, it's probably, PFAS is ubiquitous, so it's probably from that. But these are brand new samples straight from the manufacturer. One of the tests I did was on an old field in Franklin, Massachusetts that had been piled outside for quite some time. But every other sample that I have done has been brand new from the manufacturer. And yes, you're right, labs do set the detection limits. But you can ask for low detection limits. So when I send mine to Eurofins, which is the lab that I tend to use most of the time, I tell them that to go as low as they can. And yes, it's true that liquids and solids have different detection limits. But when you do the SPLP, the synthetic precipitation leaching procedure, you're measuring a liquid after, so you can get in parts per trillion. So you can't tell me that you can't get these lower detection limits and that the artificial turf industry is presenting these parts per million because that's as low as you can go, because I know for a fact that's not true because we test them in parts per trillion all the time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. A question here for Professor Peasley from Zenutayan. Great talk, and I think the FTOH hypothesis is interesting. If we are going to extract FTOH from artificial turf, should we use more aggressive conditions or solvents? Thanks.
That's a very good question. Actually, I don't think you want to get too aggressive on it because you will turn it into PFOA if you're too oxidizing. So we had not looked for it before, and the method by Zuccaro and all that was published recently, I think, is the one where they found 300 parts per billion of FTOH, A2 FTOH specifically, which means it was not a full telomer suite of 6-2, 4-2, 12-2, 10-2. It was just A2. And that turns out to be a byproduct of a certain type of fluoropolymer manufacturing. And so I think that's why it's there. And that's why that one's interesting. That can probably be taken out with relatively gentle ones, but nobody's ever measured it until this recent paper. That's why it's novel. And I think if you want to, I argue that we be a little bit more aggressive because we'll see more. And then we can say, is that an overreach? We see plenty with fairly normal, and I'd say it's equivalent to a couple of years of oxidation on the field. But this I would do even a gentle extraction, but you need to have a GC mass spec set up instead of an LC mass spec to measure that. And that's why it hasn't been reported widely up till now.
Great, thank you, Dr. Peasley.
Ashley, may I jump in here for a second? There was one question that was answered from typing earlier in our Q&A session. I just want to read for folks who may be on the phone. And that question was from anonymous attendee. Dr. Peasley, are the PFAS alternatives in the earlier presentation, such as boron nitride, plausible substitutes for PFAS that can be used as extrusion and slip aids in the manufacture of artificial turf? Can artificial turf manufacturers reformulate without using regrettable substitutes? The provided answer by Dr. Peasley was that those substitutes are fluorine-free, but he doesn't know if they would work for those types of polymers, and it's something great for the industry to look into. Good question.
Awesome, thank you so much, Armin. A question here from Anna Grossman. I have seen industry and sports.org refer to the FRAP as evidence of safety of artificial turf. Indeed, the Synthetic Turf Council makes those claims now on their website. Can you explain what the Department of Toxic Substances Control is not satisfied with the FRAP and feels the need to further study this product? Looks like this be directed for someone from DTSC.
Thank you for the question, Anna.
Go ahead,
I'm
Armin.
not familiar with FRAP, so I'd be interested in if you have more information on that, and also have Christine chime in as well.
Armin, that's the FRAP is the EPA and CDC report that just came out in 2024 on crumb rubber. And I'm assuming that DTSC is investigating the blades and the backing because EPA did not. EPA's report, the FRAP, was both of them, the one in 2019 and the one in 2024, were solely focused on crumb rubber.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett, for that explanation. And also, I just want to remind folks that the Q&A right now is specific to our invited speakers. So if you have questions of DTSC or SCP, if you could wait till after all of the external speakers have an opportunity to answer questions, then we can answer them later during the comment period if we have time.
Wonderful, thank you for that reminder, Christine. And we have a question here from Bob Chipola. Dr. Peasley, how and where can I test water runoff from the local plastic grass fields and samples from 2 wells adjacent to PG soccer fields at our local park? I'm in Sonoma County, California.
Yeah, water testing is widely available. It's expensive. The commercial test that Carla mentioned, Eurofins, which is a great lab, but there's several other labs, good ones in California as well, that you can get. If you get certified labs, ones that run the Department of Defense certification, for example, they're top-notch labs, so they do quality work. They will charge you $200, $300, $400 a pop to do this type of work on a water sample, probably $300 nowadays. And it will take a couple of weeks to return. I would just be very careful as you design your test, homeowner or any public interest, to design something that is a control as well as the sample. So one that you think ran off the field versus one that was upstream of the field. And that's pretty easy to determine without having to trespass and without having to do anything to get a public water or your own well water or things like that. And you can do those sorts of studies. And you'll the test limits of 4 part per trillion. Many of the labs can do better than that, and they'll show you what levels are currently in water. And if you can look upstream and downstream of a field, that's what people are starting to do. And I think you'll find lots of people interested in doing that, but it does cost a lot of money, unfortunately.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Dr. Peasley. Jerome Cruz has a question, possibly outside scope of webinar, but heat effects were mentioned, so this question may be relevant. Dr. Bennett, are there comparative advantages to natural turf in its ability to sequester carbon dioxide and release oxygen from a greenhouse gas / climate change perspective?
Absolutely. Great question. And usually when I talk about artificial turf, I have some slides on this. So yes, that's true. If you have a natural grass field, it sequesters carbon dioxide and emits oxygen. And artificial turf does the opposite. There's some evidence that it emits carbon dioxide and methane. And the greenhouse gas emissions with artificial turf are much, much higher, obviously, than natural turf, which has natural grass, which has it actually absorbs carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So yeah, that's a huge issue. And also, of course, the heat islands, if you look at heat maps, and oh, by the way, I think it was Armin mentioned in the beginning about trying to figure out how many artificial turf fields there are in California. There's a graduate student who's working on using artificial intelligence to count the number of artificial turf fields using heat maps in a state. It's been done on Long Island so far, but they're trying it in other places, so that might come in handy. But the latest statistics from EPA, which was in their FRAP, they said there are 18,000 synthetic turf fields in the United States, about 1,500 new ones every year, half of which are replacements of existing fields. So that gives you about 750 a year, brand new ones. But yeah, the heat island and the greenhouse gas is a huge issue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. We're going to take these last few questions in the Q&A, and we have a couple hands raised, and then we are going to continue on. We have some more presentation. But let's go with Kathy Meichel's question here. Since there is no safe level because PFAS chemicals build up in and cycle or cycle through the environment and living systems, isn't it critical that zero PFAS of any type must be the goal?
I agree with that statement, but I'm sure the industry does not, and I'm not sure about the regulators, but absolutely, particularly because PFAS chemistry is complicated. They do degrade into different terminal end products. Some of the PFAS, we have no idea what their chemical formula is, let alone how toxic they are to humans or the environment. So again, the absence of evidence is not the same thing as the evidence of absence. So I agree with that statement.
Great, thank you so much. Laura Hayter has a question here. Are PFNAs in artificial turf possibly a reproductive toxin?
That's one of the, Kyla called it about 70 that you can measure. It's a C9 acid. And those are in artificial turf. I looked at the data we had. It's in 16% of the samples we looked at of the 27. It's 2 or 3 samples. It's not widely used, or doesn't widely show up. Let's put it that way. It is one of the tail end of the heavy ones. I would look more on all of the PFAS known and studied to date have potential health effects. So I wouldn't focus in on any one. Before I focused in a little bit much on because I can see it and I know why it's there. I don't know why the C9s would be there, but they could be a byproduct as well, but just at lower quantities.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Peasley. Question here from anonymous attendee. I received some artificial turf samples in a cardboard box, brand new. If I get it tested, would the test results be usable? Not sure about the collection method shipped from artificial turf company.
It depends on what you mean by usable. In a legal case, maybe not, because the chain of custody is a little interrupted, but certainly for, if you can, even if it were for a legal case, if you could sign a declaration or, a sworn statement that says that it just sat in a box and then you got it tested. But yes, absolutely, that would be useful information to test it. It's just super expensive, as Graham said.
You'd have to pay for an extraction as well as a test. And so that's also the extraction method Kyla recommends is a good one.
Very good. Okay, we're going to move over to our hands raised, and then we will continue on with our presentations today. We have Lendry Purcell with the hand up, and go ahead and you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
We were told by some farm group that it takes 3 years for the soil under a plastic grass field to build back its microbial structure and whatever it needs to create a healthy natural grass field. I was just wondering if folks could speak on that. And also to talk about pour in plastic padding as well. Thank you.
So I do know that there are some municipalities that are ripping up their end-of-life synthetic turf and going back to natural grass. I don't know specifically what kind of problems, if any, they're having, if they're putting it in the same place, but it is true that when you put, a big pad of plastic down for years, you are killing the microorganisms in the soil. It will recover. But I don't know, I don't have specifics about that. It's a great question. You can probably supplement the soil, add some fresh soil on top and aerate it before you try to put grass in. That would help. So I don't really know the answer to the question, but I imagine that it is repairable. As far as pour in place, we have tested some pour in place. It does have PFAS. In fact, in my town in Massachusetts, they're building a new elementary school, and I got up and said we can't because our wells are contaminated, and we had to spend $11.2 million on a filtration plant. So I begged them not to put in the pour in place, and they put in Corkeen, Corkeen. It's a cork product that is ADA. It's accessible for disabled people, children, and it's flat. It's got a very similar bouncy substance to the poured in place, but it does not have PFAS. I'll let you know how it goes. They're building it as we speak.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And one more question here with a hand raised for Kathy Michels. And you are free to unmute. Okay, maybe it looks like the hand was lowered. So okay, it looks like we no more question there. Okay. Thank you everyone for your great questions, and thank you so much again to our speakers for your presentations and answering all those questions that we received. We appreciate it so much. We're going to continue on with our external presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our next speakers. We have Melanie Taylor, President and CEO of Synthetic Turf Council, Anthony Daniel, Director of Research and Development for Synthetic Turf Resources, and Dennis Anderson, founder of Rematch Turf Recycling. And I will hand it over to Melanie Taylor. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Ashley. Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Taylor. I'm the president and CEO of the Synthetic Turf Council. And next slide, please. I'm delighted to be here today and provide an introduction to STC and the synthetic turf industry, as well as synthetic turf systems. Joining me today are STC members Anthony Daniel from Sport Group and Dennis Anderson from Rematch to join this discussion. Next slide, please. As a 501c6 trade association, STC's mission is to lead, educate, and advocate for the synthetic turf industry. STC is a resource for current, credible, and independent research on the safety of environmental impact of synthetic turf, as well as a provider of technical guidance on the selection, installation, maintenance, and environmentally responsible disposal of synthetic turf. Next slide, please. We represent over 170 member companies, including synthetic turf manufacturers, component suppliers, builders and installers, landscape architects, testing labs, maintenance providers, and other specialty service companies. Next slide. And to provide an industry overview, next slide, please. Here's an example of another cross-section of a synthetic turf support system. We're going from the top down. The turf blades are made of polyethylene. A thatch layer, there is made of nylon. A primary backing is made of polypropylene, and the secondary backing is made of polyurethane. The infill can be made of recycled rubber and sand, coated sand, or natural infills. Some fields may feature a shock pad for extra cushioning and often made from other post-consumer product materials. And finally, the system is supported by a very sophisticated and intentional rock base and drainage system. Turf fields do drain. Next slide, please. Communities, schools, and businesses and families across the country are choosing synthetic turf for their benefits because they allow for more playing time, rain or shine. Synthetic turf fields provide meaningful environmental benefits, including water conservation, and it eliminates the need for pesticides and fertilizers, which has been identified by the EPA as a principal cause of water pollution. And finally, synthetic turf systems help bring down costs for communities and because they're a low maintenance alternative to grass systems. And so for schools like Highland Elementary and Visalia, their new synthetic turf field actually replaced a bare, dusty, and muddy playground. And in their own words, the new field is actually a matter of safety and community benefit. Next slide, please. So in terms of regarding PFAS, our turf manufacturers are committed to ensuring that their products contain no intentionally added PFAS constituents. We use the word intentionally added as a factual term, and we are collaborating with our upstream and downstream partners to testify and verify for any additional resources in order to identify and eliminate any PFAS constituents. I do want to mention that EPA 1633 was issued this year, and it is the first EPA method that addresses PFAS in matrices other than drinking water. SCC continues to work with its members on updating our guidelines and adopt such voluntary standards that recommend EPA 1633, and as well as organic fluorine tests for affirming that PFAS were not intentionally added during the manufacturing process. Next slide, please. So look at sustainability by the numbers. Again, many significant environmental benefits to keep in mind. Again, first and foremost, greatly reducing water use. One full-size sports field can save over 1 million gallons of water each year or per each season. Infill and shock pads can easily be separated and reused for the next generation of synthetic turf. And not only does synthetic turf eliminate the need of chemical applications, but it greatly reduces CO2 emissions from lawn maintenance equipment. Next slide, please. Science is an important focus for our industry. And so here are some summaries and direct links to the latest research from national independent organizations about synthetic turf and its system components. Studies by the US EPA, the Netherlands National Institute for Health and Environment, and the European Chemicals Agency, and the National Toxicology Program all found that there are no significant differences in exposure or health risks associated with playing on synthetic turf fields that use chrome rubber, or what the scope of the study was looking at. I'd also like to here mention the Washington State Department of Health. They published an April 2017 study testing the unsubstantiated claims that soccer goalkeepers were more likely to get cancer due to high levels of chrome rubber exposure. And the research found that the players identified actually had lower rates of cancer as compared to their peer groups. Next slide, please. So I'm going to, here's my contact information, my email address. I'm going to pass it over to Anthony Daniel, Director of Research and Development for Sport Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. And thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. PFAS is an important topic, and my intention is to share my perspective and experience as a manufacturer of artificial turf. As Melanie said, I'm the Director of Research and Development at Synthetic Turf Resources, where we make both landscape and sports fields under the brands Synlawn and AstroTurf. I have over 20 years of experience in the industry, ranging from analytical and synthetic chemistry, carpet manufacturing, LVT manufacturing, and artificial turf. I'm not new to the PFAS removal game. I previously led the charge to remove PFAS and phthalates from the commercial division of one of the largest carpet companies in the world. But the topic of today is the removal of PFAS in artificial turf manufacturing. We've already heard today the definition and hazards of PFAS, and I think we're all in agreement that they're not good for our health or our environment. Is PFAS in artificial turf? Was it in turf? Some suggest artificial turf cannot be made without PFAS. Is this accurate and up to date? Well, let's talk about removing PFAS and where the industry stands. Next slide, please. Let's begin with process aids for extrusions. Process aids are the ingredient that historically did contain PFAS. Extrusion is how we make artificial turf fibers, or the yarn. These are the blades we've been talking about. Basically, we melt plastic through an extruder and squeeze it out through a small opening or die to give it shape and produce good yarn. Maybe think back and remember the Play-Doh that you squeezed through the little holes to make spaghetti as a kid. You've got the right picture. The process aid is a polymer that tends to hug the metal of the extruder and the die and provide a little cushion so the melted plastic can flow better through the equipment. Using a process aid, we can reduce the torque of the motor that is used to push the molten plastic. We smooth out the RPMs of the motor. We get a cleaner exit of the melt from the die. The quality is improved and the yarn has a nice smooth surface. There's no buildup on the edges of the die that could burn or crust over. All of these things are very important to a manufacturer because it allows you to gain serious efficiencies. You make more first quality product. You make less waste, you consume less energy, and there is overall more uptime. Process aids are used in very small amounts. They're proprietary, but if you look at a data sheet, typical loadings range from 0.25% to 2.5%, depending on your equipment and formulation. Still, they're an important part of our toolbox. Next slide, please. There's a book called the Dinesco Extrusion Processors Handbook. It's a legacy text for manufacturers. It was published in 1988 and 2000. It gives instructions on adding fluoropolymer process aids. This is, of course, during the era when chemical manufacturers were directly advertising on TV commercials for Teflon, nonstick, and Stainmaster, as well as and claiming they're modern miracles. I want you to quickly notice here that artificial turf never used these PFAS topical treatments for soil and stain release, but certainly as a polymeric process aid during that time. So education and awareness of PFAS grew, and in 2019, Synlon and AstroTurf began to remove the PFAS fluoropolymer from their process aid as one of, if not the first manufacturer to begin this journey. This was driven by environmental health concerns prior to and in anticipation of any legislative actions or restrictions. This was proactively done, and it was the right thing to do. Overall, the Synthetic Turf Council has a target for U.S. manufacturers to have no intentionally added PFAS by the end of 2024. Next slide, please. Moving on to the replacements. Okay, PFAS-free process aids. Now, the additive market responded with new non-fluorinated process aids, and these have continued to grow in efficiency and number of options and innovations. No one wants to go backwards. Replacement criteria, of course, includes checking against regrettable substitutions. In other words, the new process aid cannot be a hazard or an environmental problem. It cannot be worse than the original PFAS. It also has to perform in an equal or better way in the extrusion scenario. Does it matter if it costs a little bit more? No, it doesn't. When it comes to safety, we're going to do the right thing. Innovations in artificial turf are happening very rapidly right now, especially in the field of sustainability. I've got a picture here of the that was taken this month of the field hockey turf at the Paris Olympics. This turf is a PFAS-free, carbon-neutral system with polyethylene that was derived from sugarcane feedstock, not from petroleum. How exciting will it be to see what new innovations happen over the next 4 years when Los Angeles hosts the Olympic Games. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about other raw materials like polyethylene, soy-based polyols, or recycled primary backings? How do we control them and ensure they do not contain PFAS? Well, we have strict supplier specifications that raw materials are not to have PFAS. If they do, we're not buying it. In a world where PFAS contamination is ubiquitous and can be found in, well, you know where it is, human blood, rainwater, drinking water. Of course, there are unfortunate semantics at play when it comes to terms like PFAS-free versus not intentionally added. These distinctions can sometimes make people uneasy. In my opinion, such arguments are not practical. For clarity's sake and quality assurance, we can take the raw materials, send them for testing down to the hundreds of parts per trillion and verify whether or not PFAS is present. So by being action-oriented, taking care of what we put into our products, and intentionally keeping PFAS out of our raw materials, we can be assured that PFAS is not in our turf. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about the testing. Right now, the best method for testing the presence of fluoropolymer, the process aid, is through extractable organic fluorine. This is a combustion ion chromatography that was preceded by an extraction. Okay, this can be accurate down to maybe around 300 parts per billion fluorine. It costs $300, $400, maybe $500 depending on the extraction, as you heard previously. Unfortunately, there is a backlog at these analytical labs. It is worth the wait. Using this method, the extractable organic fluorine, we can screen for all the known 7,000 plus PFAS compounds and even the ones we do not know of. Okay. This is not just a test for regulated compounds. This is all encompassing. So the extraction part means that the analytical lab is going to violently wash the samples in a solvent, a hot solvent typically, ensuring the full composition is analyzed, not just the yarn surface, not just under rainwater extractable scenarios. This is a very comprehensive test. We're looking at the individual components. And the fact that this is the test that is going to show long chain, high molecular weight fluoropolymers like the ones we've been discussing. Now we can also use the TOPS assay. As previously stated, we can use the EPA method 1633, and that tests for the 40 specifically targeted PFAS compounds. This is a solvent extraction followed by HPLC mass spec, and these can be accurate down to the tenths of a part per billion, or in other words, hundreds of parts per trillion. But that's for specific analytes, not for all fluorine. That would be for like a PFOA. Keep in mind that these are not comprehensive, and the 1633 test would not detect a fluoropolymer process aid. It's also a little more expensive and time consuming. Now there are some other options: bomb digestion, potentiometric titration. These are pretty readily available at most any analytical lab. They're about $60 or $70, but they only test down to about 50 to 100 parts per million. It's probably a good screening tool for measurements of concentrates, raw materials, and of course, this one doesn't distinguish between organic and inorganic fluorines. Analytical methods are going to continue to evolve to meet PFAS challenges. And so just to reiterate, I think that the extractable organic fluorine is the way to go at this time. Next slide, please. I find it interesting when talking about turf that the FDA here in 2024 still says that polymerized or large molecule PFAS are, quote, not absorbed by the human body when ingested. And that, quote, the amount of PFAS used in process aids in the manufacture of food contact polymers is so small that only negligible amounts can migrate to food from this use. The FDA is not our standard for turf. How much safer, then, is artificial turf now that fluoropolymer process aids have been removed? Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, by proactively removing PFAS from artificial turf process aids, since 2019, Synlawn and AstroTurf have led the way. If you're buying turf made in the USA from an STC member, you are on the right track. Members of the Synthetic Turf Council's targets to phase out PFAS by the end of 2024 do show the industry's commitment to safeguarding both consumer well-being and environmental health. This can be done, and we're doing it. Thank you for your time and attention. And now I think we're going to hear from Rematch.
Good evening, everyone. If I look a little bit tired, then it's because I'm actually located in Holland right now at our facility in Tiel here, so it's kind of late. It's almost 9 o'clock in the evening. I was up at 6, so pardon me. I'm here to present the company Rematch and our view on the turf recycling matter. Right now, we're located in Europe, 3 facilities in Europe that we're operating right now. We'll get into the expansion part a little bit later in the presentation. I'd like to go through a few slides. There's also a video, if you can play that a little bit later when it pops up, that shows what we do and how we do it. I hope that is possible for everyone to see. Next slide, please. A little bit about the topics that I want to touch upon. The timeline, we've been around for quite a while. I'll show you what we've done. A little bit about the progress as well, what we're doing, the test procedures that we have, the traceability and the accountability. We do have some innovation, the projects and collaboration that we're doing. We have some certifications that I'd like to show as well. What we say we do is, in fact, what we do, and we can document that. Yes, we have patents around the world. We keep growing them to protect our business, and then a little bit about the expansion plans that we see. Next slide, please. So that's the timeline, and I'll tell you, I started actually a little bit earlier. It was in 2010. I started the biggest, or the largest tire recycling facility in America, actually in the world, in Houston, Texas. It processes about 100,000 tons of tires per year. Sorry, I was just reading here, and I supplied. I supplied a lot of rubber out to these football fields, and I started thinking, what do I do with all these materials coming back? And I actually had a discussion with the current CEO of AstroTurf back then, Hurt Smith, and we discussed what can we do with the problem that we're looking at in a few years. I started testing a little bit. I took the first field in from Flushing Meadows in New York, trying to separate these components at a local supplier I had, and it didn't work. But initially, it started the idea about what to do and what not to do. So I left America actually end of 2012. I sat down with the German engineers who originally developed the tire recycling concept. And I said, hey, listen, this is what I would like to do. I see great potential in separating all these components, making them into a valuable raw material that we can actually utilize again for new production cycles. So it happened, and we funded the first facility, which originally was supposed to be in America, but for some weird reason, we were granted a bunch of money from the Danish government to build our facility there, which we did in 2015, 2016. We built the first one, started operating, and quite honestly, I thought it was easier than what it actually was. But in 2017, we made it work and running 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sundays are used for maintenance in that plant. And then immediately we started the expansion plans. What do we do? Where do we build? Obviously, America being, basically home for me for quite a few years. I wanted to go to America and build over there. The investors that we had coming into the company, they were looking at Holland. They would like to build the first one in Holland, and therefore we ended up in Holland. It took us 2 years to get a permit here, and if I may jump a little bit, I think it has taken us more than 2 years to get a permit in America. So it takes quite a while to get permits for these operations, although they're non-hazardous or anything. It's just mechanical separation, but they're fairly new in their technology. So in the growth of everything, we stock listed the company as well, trying to raise capital, of course, for the huge expansion. And we were actually delisted again. There is a big private equity firm came in and delisted the company again, trying to advance the growth even further. So we have since then built the facility in Holland, in Tiel, where I'm at right now. And earlier this year, we actually opened up the facility in France, which you see the last picture in the bottom. That is the French facility, which is in operation right now as well. Next slide, please. Next. So I see all the mountains that you see and all the horror stories. I've seen them all, and I probably a little bit more than you guys, because I've been chasing it as well, trying to understand what happens and what is the market potential that I'm looking into. There's a lot of turf out there, and there are opportunities to process that. It takes time. Collection is also a problem, and legislation, not to say, that's also a problem. I'll get into that a little bit later, but landfill, incineration, recycling, I think some of the words are already diluted. What is it, in fact, what we do, and how many verifications do we have to present in order for us to be approved and accepted? It varies from country to country. Even though Europe is one large union, we have different set of rules. We interpret the rules differently. So it's quite tricky also to transport these kinds of materials from country to country. And there's not really a single country over here that has enough material for one of our facilities. So it's kind of tricky. Anyway, the market is enormous, and I could probably build 50 of my facilities, and still we would only process a small percentage of the turf that is out there. Next slide, please. What we have built is a mechanical recycling solution, basically separating all the components from each other. We get the fields in. They are sleeved or bagged before we actually get it in. And we produce in batches, meaning one field at the time. We analyze everything prior to taking it in to understand the components that we have. And we produce in batches, meaning we produce one field at a time, but also fields that are alike after each other, so we don't have to change the settings of the machines that we have. So we produce at the first facility in Denmark. We process around 120 full-size fields, including rubber and sand, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The facility that we have here in Holland processes 250 fields. And the one in France, in Erstein, also produces 250 fields. They produce 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So basically, when we load the rolls into our process, we really don't see anything until they come out at the other end in super sacks divided into the different fractions that we have. The turf fiber, the backing of the carpet, the rubber and the sand, could be cork as well, or sand. Could be only rubber as well. Could also be nothing, except for fibers and backing. It all depends on the input, of course. We aim to produce a very clean material after our process in order for us to achieve the highest value, of course, of the components when they're coming out. The products that are coming out is classified as a product and is no longer waste. It's not considered waste anymore. And that requires a significant cleanliness. Next slide, please. And that's where the video was supposed to be. And I saw that you have not received the link to that video, but that can be provided for sure. We are willing to share that in later in the chat or whatever. Next slide, please. So the materials that we got coming out, we have the crumb rubber, which is the tires that we know. We are currently facing a rubber ban in Europe, in effect in 2031. So we're phasing out the rubber from the football fields. So we are actually sending the rubber into the compression molding industry. The rubber mats that are made by companies like Mohawk and Apache Mills. We have the rubber mats made by Regapol and Ecor. So cow mats, stall mats, gym mats, whatever that they use these rubber crumbs for. We have the sand. We are currently supplying it back into the football fields as well. It's 99.7% clean, meaning basically cleaner than what you get from the quarry. It's dry. So very suitable. It's screened for the right size as well. But we actually have agreements with producers of mortar or grout, like the Saint-Gobain, the Weber brands that are using that for the mortar. And then the plastic fibers that we get out, climbing up the value chain, meaning, initially making it into agglomerate, densifying the product, using it in cheaper plastic items like the cable band protection sheet. We have made acoustic panels for interior use as well. There are some here behind me, as you can see. We have the plastic benches and the plastic fences as well, but we have, during our collaboration with the European Union and some of the turf manufacturers, we have actually developed a cleaning process that enables us to extrude a granule out of the fibers and use it in thin wall injection molding, as well as the core of a new turf fiber that is being installed right now. So we're constantly working on the fiber, trying to achieve a higher value and a better purity of that product. Next slide, please. About the fibers, initially we had received 2.5 million euros from Horizon 2020, the European Union, to develop a truly circular model to make that turf fiber go into a new fiber. We had found a solvent separation, the Creosolve, which is developed by Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. And we succeeded in utilizing that and separating the polyethylene from the other polymers, enabling us to extrude a yarn. In order for us to use a process like that, we need a significant volume to make it feasible. So during that process and trying to achieve a higher yield in that process, we actually came across that fine dust filtration that enabled us to clean the material good enough actually to extrude it straight away into a fiber. And together with partners, we have developed a turf fiber where 50% of the new fiber is actually consisting of end-of-life turf. Not everything can go in there. I just have to admit it. I wish everything could, but we're looking at probably 30% of what we get in that is suitable for that kind of process. But if it's not suitable for yarn extrusion, then it's actually suitable for thin wall injection molding, suitable for the acoustic panels, which is a non-woven technology as such. So we are currently installing 4 fields around Europe as part of the program that we were part of. 2, one in France that I was on last week, one in Austria that is also done. We're doing one in Denmark, and then we're doing one in outside Amsterdam here in Holland later this month. Those are the first 4 that are being installed. Next slide, please. We have the recycled SBR, as we call it, the end-of-life tires. We're basically separating those from the sand and the other impurities. Everything is tested again and utilized either as infill in the turf market, but also in the compression molding as well, just as clean as what you get from the tire recycler as well. We have quite a bit of EPM in the European market, especially in the German market. Not really the best material as such, but we try to utilize it in cheaper rubber items, compression molding. You don't have a lot of that in America. The TPEs as well. The TPEs is highly valuable material. We're utilizing that in the turf fields as well as a new infill. Still small percentage compared to the SBR. So next slide, please. The sand, 99.7% clean. It's quartz sand. It's sub-rounded. It drains well. It's a really, really high-value sand, where some of these construction companies also need to be circular. So they're looking very much at utilizing that sand either in cement or in the mortar, as I mentioned. So we're currently supplying quite a bit of sand into that market at a decent price, if I might say so. And we're also supplying into the turf field, as sand is it's not going to be around forever, that sub-rounded quartz sand. So price is quite good for utilizing it again and again and again. Next slide, please. Oh, the backing. That's my headache. To be honest, it varies from company to company. It mostly consists of PP, and every now and then they tend to mix a little bit of PET in it, and that causes issues in my extrusion phase. We have a lot of latex this side of the pond, and you have a lot of polyurethane on your side of the pond. Separated out, it's used as a filler today in compression molding. I have to admit, we also incinerate some that are simply not used, simply too contaminated, that we can utilize in other applications. Next slide, please. Test procedure, traceability, and accountability. We have a lot of tests. We analyze to death before we even take the material in. We want to make sure that we can make value out of these components. So we actually analyze and we price everything based on what is the value of the components coming out of our process. So we might have a slightly different mindset than some of the other people out there. We're not a traditional waste company. We want to make money on the back end of our process, and if we cannot make money, then we'd rather say no. We have different test methods that we utilize, but we are obligated to report to the authorities on a monthly basis what we have done with the material, where has it gone, what have we disposed of, what is the production numbers of what we do. So we basically report on everything to the Danish, Dutch, and French authorities. We are under strict regulation on what we do. So we have to be as transparent as possible with everything. And that's why we go through a bunch of these verification schemes, the ISO certification. We had the ETV, the environmental technology verification. We had the ISCC Plus. We had EUTSAT Plus. I mean, we have so many of these different certifications verifying what we do. We spend a fortune on testing. We also use Eurofins. We have not been able to get a standardized test method for the PFAS. What we have done ourselves is that we have analyzed based on the European part of the Synthetic Turf Council and their guideline. We have not detected anything in the resin that we have made after our process. We really don't have a test method that we can use. If we had, we would do it every single time, for sure. Next slide, please. So that's the projects that we're talking about. Part of the Victoria Group, no commercial for them at all, but they were the first one actually to do it. We have a co-extrusion where the core of the fiber is 50% recycled content. You see the picture where you see the darker core is actually the recycled material from end-of-life turf. And that is running now in full production, and it lives up to the quality of new. And potentially could probably be a little bit cheaper if we run it at full scale. And once we get into that, potentially could be cheaper than virgin. But let's see. And then we have they have developed a backing as well, where they utilize some powder made from other granules made from turf. Those that are not suitable for yarn extrusion, they're actually suitable for powderizing. So the powder is actually acting in the coating of the backing. So we are about 50% content in the total system of end-of-life materials. And those are the fields that are installed that I mentioned in France, Austria, Denmark, and Holland. Visible. Everybody can test it if they want to. Next slide, please. Thin wall injection molding. We have the ground reinforcement, grit tiles, as they would call it, for parking lots as well. thin wall injection molding, where we utilize 50% of our material in the injection molding of these tiles here. Massive market as well. Good market for these products. Sell quite a bit of volume into that. They can also be recycled again afterwards. We have a partnership with Green Matter here in Holland, and they use Purus in Germany to make these brick tiles, as we call them. Next slide, please. Then we have these modular sports flooring. I know you have a few manufacturers in America as well, but these are made by Bergo in Sweden, made by 50% of our material. So that's a modular basketball court, or whatever you do. They have them around the cities in Amsterdam and Arnhem, and I think Ghent also has one here. So highly used as well. Thin wall injection molding, very tricky. It requires a very clean material as well. It can also be recycled after the use of that. Next slide, please. So since the beginning, nobody believed what we were doing, including probably some of the people that I heard speaking today. So we had to verify all the claims that we have. And I fully understand that it's very difficult to understand something you haven't seen, and we're not present in America as it is right now. We're working on that. But we have really done everything to certify what we do, but also compared ourselves to all the others out there. So here's a list of the other recyclers that we have verified by European Synthetic Turf Council. They are out there. So we're just certifying everything. Next slide, please. Yes, patents, one thing. Expansion, wonderful. We're coming. It takes time. It costs money. We're $100 million in. It will take some time. Next slide, please. Yes, we are in Denmark and Holland. We have the one in France. It's not colored yet. We want to build the one in Pennsylvania. The legislation is playing games with us, I think. California as well. We need the one in Pennsylvania first. Then we go to California. There's room for 10 of our facilities in America. I'd love to build them all at the same time, but I don't have $100 million sitting in my account right now, but we're working on that as well. Next slide. That was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis and Angie and Melanie. We're going to open it up for Q&A. And in the interest of time, we're going to answer questions until about 12:25 p.m. It looks like we have about 10 questions submitted in the Q&A box, and we do have some hands raised. I'm going to have the folks with their hands raised ask their questions first, but we'll work through these questions and we will answer all of them. It just may not be live, so that we can give enough time for our public comment portion as well at the end of the meeting. So we'll just jump right in. We have a question from Diane Wolke, and you can unmute and ask your question.
Good afternoon. This is Diane Wolke. I'm a board member of Safe Healthy Playing Fields, Inc., a national nonprofit. This question is for Melanie Taylor. Melanie, can you please tell us how STC defines PFAS and PFAS-free?
Thank you, Diane, for the question. I appreciate that. I understand your question. I'm probably not the best person to answer that because the Synthetic Turf Council does not make definitions on PFAS. I mean, I think as what was mentioned earlier, just like we don't make up the testing standards either. So we look at regulators for such definitions. We look at the science community for those definitions of the chemicals. So we do not have our own definition.
Okay, and I'd like to make a follow-on comment, if I may. Independent third-party testing should be the standard. You should never accept testing that is done by an industry that has a vested interest in making a sale. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. I appreciate the comment. Didn't hear the question, but please refer to my slide number 10, where we have links to independent third-party and national organizations about synthetic turf and its system components, as well as its exposure and health risks associated with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. And we're going to ask that questions that are submitted, any comments that we save for the comment portion, and to submit questions for this portion of the Q&A. And let's jump into Andrea Ventura. When parents indicate the safety of the new fields, how are the Visalia news story with parents praising the turf? What info are they given about the chemical issues involved? It seems that compared to mud, this would seem preferable, but how informed were the parents?
I brought up that story, so I'm happy to respond. Really we often, and I think that's an example of communities across the country and why they're choosing synthetic turf. Most often, and we're compared to grass, like as if it's grass. Synthetic turf is coming in to replace lush, sustainable, non-toxic grass. That's usually not the case. We are a product that provides a solution. So oftentimes owners are experiencing unmanageable fields. They're hard, they have rocks, there's holes, and that can be evaluated by a third party test consultant, either an architectural firm or a testing lab can do testing on the field and determine, is this field suitable for its application. So when parents are weighing and looking at what is existing and how synthetic turf provides a solution, we're here as STC to provide guidance for the selection process, and again, the installation, maintenance, testing, and disposal of turf. So I hope that helps give a little bit of color of why synthetic turf is considered.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Leanne McAlife, and I apologize for the pronunciation there. If a PFAS is intentionally added to the manufacturing process for extrusion purposes with the full knowledge that the PFAS contacts the product and will reside on the product post-manufacturing, how can industry honestly claim PFAS are not intentionally added to the product?
Yeah, I'll address that. I think the answer is within the question. If you intentionally add to this, then you cannot claim it to be not intentionally added. So that's why the manufacturers are removing it so that they can claim that it's not added.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And we have a question here from Andrea Ventura. Did Mr. Daniels say that they test materials only down to hundredths parts per trillion? I ask because that seems pretty high.
Yeah, again, we don't set the limits or the methods. It depends on the substrate and what you have. If you send in water, you're going to get a better detection limit than if you send in a piece of plastic composite. That's what the analytical industry can provide us at this time. And it just depends on what you're testing too. 100 parts per million would be for a specific, one of those specific PFOA type discrete chemicals, not for a classification like fluorine. So that's a very specific, that's a specific answer to your question, but yeah. We don't set the method detection limits.
Thank you, Anthony, for that. We have an anonymous attendee asking a question for Anthony Daniel, mentioned inorganic fluorine in his presentation. I have been told by landfill covered turf companies that their products would test as positive in a total fluorine test because of inorganic or other fluorines that are from mineral compounds. What are these inorganic or nutrient fluorines coming from?
I don't know. I'm not in the landfill business, but there are ways analytically to distinguish between inorganic and organic fluorines. So we don't have to worry about that.
Thank you for that clarification. We have another question here. Can you address the Martha Vineyard soil sample study that shows natural grass fields with its use of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, grass cutting, grass painting, watering, etc., are actually higher in PFAS chemicals by 5 times of artificial turf grass fields? It is puzzling that so much talk is centered around this topic. Has natural grass sports fields been tested?
I can answer that since I'm very familiar with that. That's I don't know who this anonymous attendee is. I wish I knew who it was, but that is actually not correct. It's not 4 to 5 times higher. There were 2 fields on Martha's Vineyard, natural grass fields, that were tested. One of them happened to be where firefighters were training and washing their trucks. So obviously it had some higher PFAS levels. The bottom line is, yes, PFAS are ubiquitous. It's in our rain. But the fact that these are forever chemicals means that adding more is always a bad idea. So if you're saying to me, oh, well, the soil's already contaminated, so let's put down some PFAS-laden artificial turf on top of that, that is not the answer. You're going to get more PFAS, not less. In this particular example, they were comparable. There was one field that was higher, and again, that's where the fire trucks were being washed, and they held training there.
I think these questions are for us. Sorry to interrupt, but we were very quiet during the other panelists' presentations. So I would follow up with, I have the link to that article if you're interested in reading that about how the soil testing was done. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, and that is a good reminder for these questions specifically will be for the presentations that we just had. And we'll go a couple more minutes, and then we're gonna address some of those questions in the Q&A box just for the sake of time here. But we have a question for Dennis Anderson. How many old plastic fields has Rematch recycled into new plastic fields in Denmark?
It's actually not done in Denmark, the one, because it's a newly developed process that we have. We have processed around 1,000 fields total. We have just developed this new process. We have made 4 fields so far. 2 of them are installed. 2 of them are being installed in the month of September. The program just ended. The funding for the program just ended here well, we got the last money at least a month ago. So it's brand new technology that is being rolled out right now. But 4 full-size field, 1 in Fleming-Merlebach in France, and 1 in Vienna, 1 in Copenhagen, and 1 outside Amsterdam. That is what has been done. But we have processed more than 1,000 fields.
Great, thank you, Dennis. Question from Kathy Meeples. Can carpets with recycled content be recycled again? Can any of the other products be recycled again?
That must be for me as well. Yes, absolutely. We talked about it with our partner as well, that if you cannot use it for a fiber again, you can definitely use it in the coating of the carpet. So you're probably extending the lifetime maybe with 20, 25 years or something like that with that plastic for sure. And just because it cannot be recycled into a new artificial turf, that doesn't mean it cannot be recycled again. It can go into other products as well. Same thing with the other products that we deliver to. You know what? We cannot make a dead end. That's just a no-go for us. It's not part of our world.
Great, thank you so much. There's another question here from S.E. Hinton to Rematch. What happens to the chemicals added to polymers during artificial turf production? For example, when PFAS or other chemicals are added to polyethylene, how are they handled during recycling? Where does it go in your process? Surely you can ask Eurofins to check more closely.
I could. It remains in the polymer unless you do a chemical recycling, which is not really up and running as we see it right now. It remains in the polymer if it hasn't been washed out over time. As I said, we don't have a test method for it. I don't know how to test it. We can ask Eurofins. Yeah, they can extract anything out of everything. Honestly, it's just a matter of how many chemicals you use to extract it. but we honestly don't have a test method for it. So it's very difficult to detect, to be honest.
Thank you, Dennis. Let's see here. We have a question from, and it looks like maybe we can do one more question here. We do want to be mindful of time, so we will still address all of the questions and get you answers in the Q&A box. We just may need to cut off the live portion so that we can leave a little bit of time for public comment and to receive your comments here. But let's see here if there's. We have an anonymous question here. Is the silica sand recovered and reprocessed from pure quartz, or is it beach sand?
It's not beach sand,
Not
that's for
beach
sure.
sand. Yeah.
That won't work.
Thank you so much. Okay. And I appreciate everyone leaving comments. We do comments and questions. We do want to have some time for the public comment portion. I want to really thank our speakers, Melanie, Anthony, and Dennis. We are going to ask that some of the questions may be addressed in the chat box. I do apologize that we're running out of time. So we want to take just a short break, a short 5-minute break right now. And then we're going to go into our public comment portion of the meeting to end us out, and some closing remarks at the very end as well. But we will try and get to all of your questions that have been already submitted. With that, thank you again to our speakers for your presentations. We'll go ahead and take a short 5-minute break. We're right at 12:29 here, so let's meet back right around 12:34, 12:35. Thank you so much. Hey, I want to welcome everyone back from that short break. We're going to go ahead and move into the public comment portion of our meeting. I want to thank you for sticking with us, and thank you to all of our presenters. But now we would like to hear from you. And we ask that you please keep your comments to 3 minutes or less per comment to allow for as many comments as possible during the duration of our meeting. And just as a reminder, you can raise your hand and we will call on you to mention your comment. And you can also submit it in the Q&A box, and we'll do it that way. So it looks like we have a couple hands up already. We're going to dive right in just for the since we're at time here, we'll just go ahead and dive right in. So it looks like Catherine Dodd, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute and make your comment.
This is Catherine Dodd. I'm a registered nurse and I work in the area of environmental health with families advocating for chemical and toxic safety. This was an excellent presentation. I really appreciated the science, and hope that, but also wanted to comment on Andre's answer when I asked about latent effects. He said that your report will be done just on what's in the literature. And I have to point out that it took us decades to make the connection between tobacco and cancer because of the delayed effects that were noted. And because the industry, as industries do, tried to hide the effects and created doubt and made us wonder if it was really true. So I'm hoping that you will adhere to the principle that you said at the beginning of this call, that DTSC abides by the principle of the precautionary principle. We shouldn't be doing things unless we know they are safe. We shouldn't just think they might be safe. So please don't just stick to the scientific literature, because kids exposed today won't develop cancer until they're 20 or 30. And we can't wait that long. We need to stop that exposure. And lastly, I'll just say this. I think what's happening with rematch is exciting. Perhaps we should just put on hold until all plastic grass can be recycled in that safe way, any further production or installation of plastic grass? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for your comment. And we have a hand raised with Suzanne York. Please feel free to unmute yourself and submit your comment.
Hi, I'm Suzanne York. I'm a member of the Pasadena Environmental Advisory Council and have been working on a memo to advise our council to ban artificial turf. I really appreciate Catherine Dodd's comments because this is an urgent situation. I know it's mostly about the chemicals in PFAS, but I was very, very concerned about the misleading information that the Synthetic Turf Council apparently is giving out about the water savings. Because we're in a climate emergency and we have the heat island effect of turf, it requires a tremendous amount of water to cool it. My colleague Diane Mulkey that spoke earlier took some measurements in Pasadena. The regular grass field was 75 degrees on the day a few weeks ago. Ambient air temperature, 80 degrees. The temperature on the turf field was 144 degrees. So obviously this is very dangerous for our people that are using the field. And I think I just want to know where that data came from, that an average field can save between 500,000 and 1 million gallons of water per year. I think that is completely false information. So I wanted to address that question in particular to Melanie Taylor, but I don't know if she's still on the call or not. Hello?
Am I allowed to answer?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know. Hi, Suzanne. I would actually reference the Sports Field Managers Association. That's where we got that number. They mentioned the 1 million gallons per season.
That's been completely debunked. That if that was true, or they thought it was true 10 years ago, it's not true anymore. In order to maintain the fields, they have to be cooled down.
I apologize for interrupting, but this time right now is simply dedicated to comments to the Safer Consumer Products Program, but we do encourage you guys to send your questions to the speakers outside of the rest of the meeting.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Sure.
Okay, we have a hand raised from Andrea Ventura for public comment.
Yeah, just 2 points. I want to get to the water use issue, not to argue with anyone about it, but because I'm sure it's a consideration as you look at chemicals. I work for Clean Water Action. We advocate for water savings. However, it is not a water saving when you are contaminating water, and we are very concerned about the impacts of chemicals on, excuse me. We are very concerned about the impacts of chemicals, whether they be PFAS or phthalates or other toxic chemicals getting into our groundwater supplies. Just to use PFAS as an example, 25 million people already are known to have PFAS detections in their water supplies in this state alone. And that number is expected to go up as we expand our testing. So the water use aside, I'm concerned about that issue with chemicals in artificial turf. I also just want to say to the Safer Consumer Program that, this was a very good workshop. I came, as I said before, very interested in PFAS because I've worked on that issue for a long time now, and I'm concerned about the use of these, that we need to stop using them in both products and processes. That said, I would just one more time say to DTSC, you've got an opportunity here to maybe do multiple processes, but to address not only PFAS and orthophthalates and microplastics, or do them individually, but do them at the same time so that we come out the end with truly better products at the end, or restrictions on those products as necessary. But let's not just do one part of the problem. Let's do a more comprehensive and holistic approach. And I'm very aware of how how the Safer Consumer Products program works. I was involved in its creation, but it would be nice to do the whole product and not just address one problem in a product category. So I just want to put that out there for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. We're going to have Diane Wolk and, oh, it disappeared on me. I believe Diane Wolke, but let me check. Oh, no, okay, I'm sorry. We're going to have Pamela Trussell next to submit public comment. And should give you permission to unmute.
Yes, thank you. I'm Tamala Trussell, founder of Move Past Plastic. And I wanted to just say that we are taking one of the most toxic products that man has created, both tire rubber and plastic. And we're saying to our most vulnerable population, here, play on this. And then we're recycling, which isn't really recycling, we're downcycling the product into more products to replace what the earth has given us, which is our topsoil, which takes thousands of years to create and is made up of billions of organisms. And we're stripping that off and saying, here, play on this potentially toxic, well, it is a toxic substance because we know the chemicals that went into making the products. And so, like they said, we're just waiting for the studies to catch up with the health impacts. So I just don't see, when you're increasing stormwater issues, having chemical exposures to our environment, our most vulnerable youth, and creating more of a plastic world, it's it can only get worse and not better. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamala. Our next comment is going to be from Laura Hayter.
Hello, you hear me?
Yes.
So first was the question, which chemicals did you decide were the priority chemicals, but is PFNA on your priority chemical list? Because PFNA was found to be a male reproductive toxin, well, a possible male reproductive toxin.
Laura, I'm going to ask that you submit that question to Safer Consumer Products at dtsc.ca.gov. Right now, we're simply receiving public comments. We'll respond to any questions over email.
Thank you so much, Christine. That is a good reminder. Just for this portion of the meeting, we're not doing a Q&A. This is to receive public comment. So if you do have a comment to record, then we would like to hear from you. And any questions, please direct at our email or to the speakers directly. So we'll ask Cindy Russell to that you can submit your comment.
Yes, thank you. I just have some issues with a full picture of, and maybe I'm misquoting, but the full picture with regards to crumb rubber and reused cycle tires. I think that they do have a lot of carcinogens in them. Number two, the silica that's used and removed. And I just have to say, I appreciate all the efforts in recycling here. But if this is from pure quartz does break down into dust and that is a respiratory carcinogen and a pulmonary toxin. The other thing is there's a lot of proprietary chemicals that are added, and this has been a problem in many issues that we face dealing with toxins. I'm a physician, and we look at fracking chemicals that are proprietary, and the proprietary chemicals should be really non-proprietary because we really don't know, and then we have to test for them. There are flame retardants, colorants, UV stabilizers. There's so many different toxins that are added to these artificial turfs, and we really don't know until we test them all. So when I agree with comments by Catherine Dodd that we should put a moratorium on this until we can really know that these are truly safe. There's also a lack of regulation. We're not looking at the temperatures. There's no regulation to monitor the temperatures to protect kids, to have general guidelines, monitoring of all these chemicals that are exposed, and yet we're allowing a lot of new products that really haven't been tested. I think also when you look at life cycle analysis for carbon footprint, we're not really looking at that when we say that they're carbon neutral. You really have to look at the entire aspect of this. And also with regards to water, if you look at a study was done showing that manufacturing of artificial turf used the same amount of water as watering natural grass turfs for 4 years. So that's already a huge amount of water. So I think that has been overestimated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cindy. Andy Schrader, we will allow you to unmute and submit your comment now.
Hi, Andy Schrader, I'm dad. I have a 11-year-old soccer player who is really inspired by our Olympic soccer team, and she loves soccer. Number one, public comment should not be interrupted by the industry. Number two, I'm tired of the intentional false information from industry using the same strategy that they've done cigarettes and climate change. Oh, everything's fine, everything's fine. Regarding the very significant dangers of the chemicals to children and to our water supply, young children and athletes should not be used as guinea pigs as the industry works out how to further greenwash and chemwash their products. If there is not a recycling market for artificial turf, regardless of recyclable, it's not being recycled, so it should not be counted. Even if there's like one place in Podunk, Indiana that takes it with styrofoam, it's not actually being recycled. It's not recycled. The bottom line is we heard from actual, real, unbiased scientists who have not been paid off by the industry. These chemicals in artificial turf are dangerous to children. Children are more exposed due to their being closer to the turf, more exposed to inhalation, to physical contact. The biochemical buildup in their bodies is more because their bodies are smaller, and we don't actually know the long-term impacts of these chemicals because there's been no studies, and we're really to look at long-term impacts before products are introduced rather than after the fact. Thank you.
Okay. And we have a hand raised for comment from John Boderoff next.
Yes, hello. My name is John Bodorf with cleanersforkids.org. Synthetic turf is plastic grass, and it contains many toxic chemicals and substances that are harmful to children's health and development. It increases the risk of injuries, burns, and heat exhaustion, and is harmful to athletes, families, wildlife, birds, fish, ecosystems, the environment, and climate. We are deeply concerned with the toxic and carcinogenic chemicals like benzene, phthalates, styrene, VOCs, and PFAS, along with PHs and heavy metals that have been found in the plastic blades, backing, underlayment pads, and infill of plastic grass. Every plastic grass field tested has been found to contain PFAS, and there are no safe levels of PFAS. Children are especially susceptible to toxic exposure because of their developing biological systems. Early exposure to toxins can harm brain, reproductive, or immune system development that leaves permanent and irreversible damage while increasing the risk of cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, and fertility issues. As the world transitions from fossil fuels to renewable energy, the fossil fuel industry is now focused on plastics and petrochemicals. Over 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuel-based chemicals, and plastics are predicted to drive almost half of the demand for oil and methane in the coming decades. We must stop the use of these plastic fields. Plastic grass releases microplastics, which is a significant risk to human health. Microplastics have been shown to cross the blood-brain barrier, increasing the risk of brain inflammation, neurological disorders, and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Hot toxic grass is harmful to children's health and the environment. The decisions we make today affect our children's health and future. Thank you from cleanerforkids.org.
Thank you for that comment, John. And we're going to move to Ellie Goldberg.
Hello. I just want to add that I'm really concerned about normalizing the contamination. It is really misleading for proponents of artificial turf to assume that a natural grass field is only manageable with pesticides, herbicides, synthetic fertilizers. There are experts, and I listed them in the Q&A, who have expertise in soil science and many years experience managing organic, natural grass, high performance, high demand organic fields. So you can have great fields and safe kids at the same time. To perpetuate the myth or the ignorance that grass fields can only be safe and that the mismanagement or not having the expertise to create great organic fields, it needs to lead to the artificial turf means that you're never going to have the knowledge and the experience to maintain a cost-effective, high-performance grass field. So I urge people not to normalize the acceptance of this, any level of contamination. When you're fighting cancer or when you're pregnant and have a developing child, you're talking about cellular level changes, and that's exactly what the contaminants attack. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to move to, and it looks like the hand was lowered. Okay, well, I appreciate everyone today and for submitting your comments. If you do have any questions, we've put up and it looks like we might have time for one more, Diane Wolke.
Thank you. Diane Wolke again from Safe Healthy Playing Fields Board of Directors. I want to offer my profound thanks to DTSC and SCP for finally bringing this forward. This has been a long time in the making. I was the initial instigator of this, went back when there was the proposal to regulate PFAS in household and commercial carpets. This has taken a Herculean effort by many people. And I'm glad to see that California is going to continue to lead the way in consumer product safety. We have a long history of having the strongest consumer product laws in the country. I also want to say that the timing couldn't be better when we are faced with the triple whammy of the climate crisis, the loss of biodiversity, and the absolute tsunami of plastic waste that has enveloped the planet. So kudos to everybody, all of the scientists, all of the environmental hazard engineers. You all know who you are, as well as the staff. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you again to everyone today, to all of our speakers, to all of our panelists. There's some information still on the screen here. If there are any written comments that were not submitted live today, we want to hear from you. Please submit written comments via our CalSafer website, or you can email us at saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov. And we will take those that way. But if you want to take a look on our website, we will be uploading a recording of today's meeting. And also there's the links there for the CalSafer website to submit your public comment. And any additional questions that you may have, please use that email as well. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Andre. Pass it to Andre Algazi. If he's still on the line here. Oh, perfect. And our senior environmental scientist, I'm going to just pass it on to Andre Algazi to close us out today.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I've spoken earlier. I'm Andre Algazi. I lead the Chemical and Product Evaluation branch here in Safer Consumer Products. I want to thank all of you for joining our virtual public workshop today. We're really grateful to those of you who shared your thoughts and questions today. We had a really lively exchange of ideas and information. As you think about the information you heard today and read the public background document we've posted, we hope it will inspire you to share your further ideas and data in written comments. The information that we get during these public comment periods, like the one we're in right now, is a critical part of our process, and it really does inform our decision making. Before we wrap it up, I want to acknowledge the work of our excellent staff who put together the background document and planned today's workshop, and a special thank you to Kathy Valentine, Armin Etamad, and Elena Galkina for their presentations, and to Ashley, again, for facilitating today's workshop. We're also very grateful to today's guest presenters, Drs. Kyla Bennett and Graham Peasley, Melanie Taylor, Anthony Daniel, and Dennis Anderson. Thank you all for taking your time out of your day to participate in our workshop. The information you shared today will inform our next steps, as will the comments we received from all of you who are participating in today's webinar and who aren't. With that, we'll close today's virtual public workshop. We'll be posting a video, as Ashley mentioned, in the next couple of weeks on our workshops and events webpage. And as a reminder, we're accepting public comments through our CalSafer portal until September 30th. So thanks again and have a wonderful afternoon.